Hello friends. About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you all. My name is William Johnson, and I'm 65 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on October 14th, 2003, when I was 44. It's a story I've kept to myself for over 2 decades, but now, as I approach my twilight years, I feel compelled to share it, perhaps as a warning, or maybe just to unburden myself of a secret that's weighed heavily on my conscience for far too long. Back in 2003, I was working as a senior accountant for a large firm in Denver. The job paid well, but the stress was slowly killing me. 60-hour work weeks, endless meetings, and the constant pressure of deadlines had taken their toll. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, the tightness in my chest. My doctor had warned me about high blood pressure, suggesting I take some time off to relax. So when October rolled around, I decided to take his advice. I had 3 weeks of unused vacation time, and I was determined to make the most of it. I needed to get away from the city, away from the noise and the crowds. I needed peace and quiet, and I knew just where to find it. Pinedale, Wyoming. Not many folks know about Pinedale, but it's a quiet place with some great spots for camping and fishing. I'd been there a few times before, always promising myself I'd come back for a longer stay. Now seemed like the perfect opportunity. I packed up my RV, a 28-foot Winnebago I'd bought a few years back but rarely used. I stocked it with enough food and supplies to last me the full 3 weeks, including my fishing gear and a few good books. As I pulled out of my driveway in the early hours of October 12th, I felt a sense of excitement I hadn't experienced in years. The drive from Denver to Pinedale takes about 7 hours, but I was in no hurry. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as I headed north. The bustling suburbs gave way to rolling plains, which eventually transformed into the rugged beauty of Wyoming. As I crossed the state line, I could feel the tension starting to melt away. I arrived in Pinedale late in the afternoon of October 13th. The town was just as I remembered it. Small, quiet, with a main street that looked like it belonged in another era. I stopped at the local grocery store to pick up a few last-minute items and chatted with the cashier, a friendly older woman named Martha. "Heading up to the lake?" she asked as she rang up my purchases. I nodded. "Fremont Lake. Thought I'd do some fishing, get away from it all for a while." Martha smiled, but there was something in her eyes, a flicker of, concern? Worry? But it was gone so quickly I thought I must have imagined it. "Well, you have a good time up there," she said, handing me my bags. "And be careful, the woods can be tricky this time of year." I thanked her and headed back to my RV, puzzling over her words. I'd been an outdoorsman all my life, hunting, fishing, you name it. My dad had taken me out into the woods when I was just a kid, taught me how to track deer and catch trout. I knew how to handle myself in the wilderness. Still, there was something about Martha's warning that stuck with me. As I drove out of town towards Fremont Lake, I pushed the thought aside. I was here to relax, not to worry about vague warnings from locals who probably thought any city folk were helpless in the woods. It was nearly dark by the time I found a secluded spot by the lake. The place was perfect. The water was still, reflecting the fading light like a mirror. The surrounding pine trees stood tall and silent, guardians of this peaceful sanctuary. I could already feel a sense of calm washing over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced in far too long. I set up my RV, got a small fire going, and cracked open a beer. As I sat there watching the stars come out one by one, I felt like I could finally breathe again. The cool mountain air filled my lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wood smoke. In the distance, an owl hooted softly. "This," I said to myself, raising my beer in a silent toast, "is exactly what I needed." Little did I know, as I drifted off to sleep that night, that my peaceful getaway was about to turn into something far more terrifying than I could have ever imagined. The next morning, October 14th, I woke up just as the sun was peeking over the eastern mountains. The lake was shrouded in a light mist that slowly dissipated as the day warmed up. I made myself a strong cup of coffee and sat outside the RV, watching the world come to life around me. A pair of deer emerged from the tree line, cautiously making their way to the water's edge for a morning drink. A fish jumped in the lake, creating ripples that spread out in perfect concentric circles. The air was filled with the songs of various birds, the sharp cry of a blue jay, the melodious warble of a robin, the rat-a-tat of a woodpecker hard at work. After breakfast, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the lake. I'd brought my favorite rod, a custom-made graphite beauty that had seen me through many a fishing trip. I baited my hook with a fat nightcrawler and cast my line into the still waters of Fremont Lake. Fishing, for me, has always been more about the experience than the catch. Don't get me wrong, I love the thrill of feeling a fish on the line, the battle to reel it in. But there's something magical about just sitting there, surrounded by nature, with nothing to do but wait and think I did. About my job back in Denver, about the stress and the long hours, about my family, my wife Sarah, who had passed away 5 years ago from cancer, and our daughter Emily, now grown and living in California with her husband and 2 kids. I thought about the path my life had taken, the choices I'd made, the regrets I carried. Before I knew it, the sun was high in the sky and my stomach was growling. I'd caught a couple of decent-sized trout, which I cleaned and cooked over the fire for lunch. As I sat there savoring the fresh fish and the quiet of the forest, I felt more at peace than I had in years. The afternoon was spent hiking. I found a well-worn deer trail leading away from the lake and into the dense forest. The path wound its way up into the foothills, offering breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape. The autumn colors were in full display, reds, oranges, and golds painting the hillsides in a riot of color. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to camp. I built up the fire, opened another beer, and settled in with one of the books I'd brought along, a dog-eared copy of Jack London's The Call of the Wild. The irony of reading about the Yukon wilderness while sitting in the Wyoming wilderness wasn't lost on me. That night, as I lay in my RV listening to the gentle lapping of the lake and the soft whisper of wind through the pines, I felt truly content. This, I thought, is what life should be about. Not the endless grind of work and responsibility, but moments of quiet beauty and reflection. The next day followed a similar pattern. Fishing in the morning, hiking in the afternoon, reading by the fire in the evening. I explored more of the surrounding area, discovering hidden meadows bursting with late-blooming wildflowers and rocky outcroppings that offered panoramic views of the lake and beyond. It was on one of these hikes that I first noticed something odd. I had paused to catch my breath on a steep section of the trail when I realized the forest had gone quiet. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just an eerie, oppressive silence. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warmth of the afternoon sun. I felt suddenly exposed, vulnerable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I had the distinct feeling of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees around me. Nothing seemed out of place, but the silence persisted. After a few tense moments, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the distance. The sound echoed unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. And then, as suddenly as it had fallen, the silence lifted. Birds resumed their songs. A squirrel chattered angrily from a nearby tree. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Get a grip, old man," I muttered to myself. "You're letting your imagination run wild." I made my way back to camp, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. That night, as I sat by the fire, I found myself glancing more frequently at the dark line of trees surrounding my campsite. Sleep was a long time coming, and when it did, it was filled with unsettling dreams of dark shapes moving just beyond the edge of my vision. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of the terror that awaited me in the seemingly peaceful woods of Fremont Lake. I woke on the third day feeling groggy and unsettled, the vague memory of unsettling dreams clinging to the edges of my consciousness. The morning was overcast, a blanket of gray clouds obscuring the sun and casting a gloomy pallor over the landscape. It matched my mood perfectly. After a quick breakfast and a strong cup of coffee, I decided to go fishing again, hoping the familiar routine would help shake off the lingering unease from the night before. I made my way down to the lake, noting absently that the usual morning chorus of birdsong was oddly muted. As I cast my line into the still waters of Fremont Lake, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The lake, which had seemed so peaceful and inviting just days before, now felt oppressive and somehow threatening. The surface was like glass, unbroken by the jump of fish or the ripples of a breeze. And the silence was deafening. It was then that I realized what was wrong. There were no birds, not a single chirp or call. The trees surrounding the lake stood silent sentinels, their branches empty of the usual flutter and movement of wildlife. A shiver ran down my spine despite the mild temperature. I reeled in my line, suddenly eager to be away from the quiet, watching lake. As I packed up my gear, I tried to rationalize the absence of birds. Perhaps they had simply flown south for the winter, I thought. But a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it was too early, too sudden for such a mass migration. Determined to distract myself from these unsettling thoughts, I decided to go for a longer hike, to explore deeper into the forest surrounding the lake. I packed a small backpack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit, making sure to include my hunting knife and a small caliber pistol I always carried for protection against wild animals. I set off along the deer trail I had discovered on my first day, pushing further than I had before. The forest was dense here, the trees pressing close on either side of the narrow path. The canopy overhead blocked out much of the already dim light, creating a twilight world of shadows and muted colors. As I hiked, the silence of the forest began to feel less oppressive and more expectant, like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I found myself moving more cautiously, placing each foot carefully to avoid snapping twigs or rustling leaves. After about an hour of hiking, the trail opened up into a small clearing, and there, nestled among the trees on the far side, stood an old cabin. It was a rough structure built of logs and fieldstone, with a sagging roof and shuttered windows. It looked abandoned, the wood gray and weathered with age. Curiosity overcame my caution, and I approached the cabin. The door hung crookedly on rusted hinges, swinging slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. As I drew closer, I noticed deep gouges in the wood of the doorframe, as if something with large claws had tried to force its way in, or out. My hand shook slightly as I pushed the door open, wincing at the loud creak of protesting hinges. The interior of the cabin was dim, dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that penetrated the gloom through cracks in the roof and walls. The cabin consisted of a single room, sparsely furnished with the remnants of a simple life. A rusted iron bedstead stood against one wall, a rotting mattress still in place. A rough-hewn table and single chair occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, holding an assortment of rusted cans, broken crockery, and moldering books. But it was the far wall that drew my attention and sent a chill of fear through my body. The logs were covered in a series of deep parallel scratches. They ran from floor to ceiling in places, the wood splintered and torn. Whatever had made these marks was large, powerful, and apparently desperate to get out. As I ran my fingers over the gouges, feeling the roughness of the splintered wood, a sound from outside the cabin made me freeze. It was a low, rumbling growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a bear, not a mountain lion, not any animal I could identify. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Through the open door of the cabin, I could see something moving at the edge of the clearing, something large, its form indistinct in the shadows of the trees. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, a pair of eyes caught the dim light, glowing with an unnatural yellowish sheen. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Those eyes stared directly at me. I felt pinned by that gaze, like a butterfly on a collector's board. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the forest, leaving me alone in the abandoned cabin with my racing thoughts and pounding heart. I don't remember much about my return trip to the campsite. I ran most of the way, heedless of the noise I was making, driven by a primal fear I had never experienced before. By the time I reached the relative safety of my RV, the sun was setting, painting the sky in ominous shades of red and purple. That night, as I huddled in my RV with all the doors locked and windows shuttered, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the darkness was watching, waiting. The sounds of the forest, once soothing, now seemed full of menace. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares of glowing eyes and shadowy forms with impossibly long claws. I woke frequently, each time convinced I could hear that low, rumbling growl just outside my door. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows of the RV, I made a decision. Whatever was out there in the woods, whatever had left those marks in the cabin and stalked me through the forest, I wanted no part of it. It was time to leave Fremont Lake and return to the safety of civilization. But as I was about to learn, leaving would not be as simple as I hoped. The terror that had begun in the abandoned cabin was far from over. As soon as the sun rose, I started packing up my campsite. My hands shook as I took down the awning and stowed away my camping gear. Every few moments I would stop and scan the tree line, half expecting to see those glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. By mid-morning I was ready to go. I climbed into the driver's seat of my RV, my palms sweaty on the steering wheel. As I turned the key in the ignition, I sent up a silent prayer of thanks when the engine roared to life. I pulled out of my campsite, tires crunching over the gravel and pine needles. As I navigated the winding road that led back to town, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every time I checked the rearview mirror, I expected to see something loping along behind the RV, but the road remained empty. It wasn't until I reached the outskirts of Pinedale that I began to relax. The sight of buildings, of other cars, and people going about their day helped to ground me. The terror of the past night began to feel distant, almost dreamlike in the light of day. I pulled into the parking lot of the same diner where I'd stopped on my way into town. I needed coffee, food, and most of all, I needed to be around other people. As I walked in, the bell over the door jingled cheerfully. A sound so normal and mundane that it almost made me laugh with relief. The diner was about half full, the morning rush just starting to die down. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, and the chatter of conversation provided a comforting background noise. I slid into a booth near the window, my back to the wall so I could keep an eye on both the door and the street outside. A waitress, her name tag identifying her as Doris, approached with a pot of coffee and a menu. "You look like you've seen a ghost, hun," she said, filling my cup. "Rough night?" I must have looked worse than I thought. I managed a weak smile. "You could say that. Had a bit of a scare up at Fremont Lake." At the mention of the lake, Doris's friendly smile faltered for just a moment. It was quick, but I caught it. She recovered quickly, but there was a new wariness in her eyes. "Oh, what happened up there?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral. I hesitated. How much should I tell her? Would she even believe me if I talked about abandoned cabins and creatures with glowing eyes? I decided to keep it vague. "Just some strange noises in the night," I said. "Probably nothing, but it spooked me pretty good." Doris nodded, but I could tell she wasn't entirely convinced by my explanation. "Well, the woods can play tricks on you, especially if you're not used to them. Why don't you look over the menu and I'll be back in a few to take your order?" As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something she wasn't telling me. I glanced around the diner, suddenly aware of the way conversations had quieted when I mentioned Fremont Lake. A few of the locals were casting furtive glances in my direction. I was about to call Doris back and ask her what was going on when the bell over the door jingled again. An old man walked in, his weathered face creased with age and his eyes sharp beneath bushy gray eyebrows. He looked around the diner, his gaze settling on me. Without invitation, he slid into the booth across from me. "Name's Clyde," he said, his voice gravelly. "Heard you had some trouble up at the lake?" I blinked, surprised by his directness. "News travels fast," I said. Clyde snorted. "In a town this size? You bet it does. Especially when it comes to that lake." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "What did you see up there?" There was something in his tone, a mixture of fear and anticipation. I found myself telling him everything. The silence in the woods, the abandoned cabin, the claw marks, and the creature I'd glimpsed in the clearing. As I spoke, Clyde's expression grew increasingly grim. When I finished, he sat back, running a gnarled hand through his thinning hair. "Sounds like you had a run-in with the Knockout," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The what?" Clyde glanced around as if making sure no one was listening in. The Nakut. It's an old Shoshone legend, a creature that's part man, part animal, been stalking these woods for generations. I felt a chill run down my spine. You're joking, right? Some kind of local boogeyman story? But Clyde's expression remained deadly serious. I wish I was, son, but I've seen it myself years ago. So have others in town, though most won't talk about it. We've learned to leave it alone, stay away from its hunting grounds. But why hasn't anyone reported it, called in experts or the authorities? Clyde laughed, but there was no humor in it. Who'd believe us? We'd be laughed out of the county. Besides, he added, his voice dropping even lower, some folks around here, they think the Nakut protects the town in its own way, keeps out unwanted elements, if you know what I mean. I didn't know what he meant, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. My mind was reeling, trying to process what Clyde was telling me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a superstitious old man, but I couldn't forget what I'd seen in those woods. What should I do? I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Clyde's eyes met mine, his gaze intense. You leave, today, and you don't come back. The Nakut, once it gets your scent, it doesn't forget. It'll hunt you, stalk you. It's patient, and it's got all the time in the world. A cold dread settled in the pit of my stomach. I thought about those claw marks in the cabin, the glowing eyes in the darkness. But what if it follows me? Clyde shook his head. It won't leave its territory, but if you stay. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I nodded, pushing my untouched coffee away. I'd lost my appetite. Thank you, Clyde, for telling me this. He reached across the table, his hand gripping my arm with surprising strength. Remember, son, don't tell anyone about this. They won't believe you, and you don't want that kind of attention. Just go home and try to forget. As if I could ever forget. I left the diner in a daze, Clyde's warnings echoing in my head. The sunny streets of Pinedale suddenly seemed sinister, hiding dark secrets behind their quaint, small-town facade. I climbed back into my RV, my hands shaking as I turned the key. As I pulled out onto the main road, I glanced in my rearview mirror. Clyde stood in the doorway of the diner, watching me leave, and beyond him, at the edge of town where the forest began, I could have sworn I saw a tall, dark figure standing unnaturally still among the trees. I pressed down on the accelerator, the RV lurching forward. I didn't slow down until Pinedale was far behind me, nothing but a speck in my rearview mirror. The drive back to Denver was a blur. I barely noticed the changing landscape, my mind too preoccupied with replaying the events of the past few days. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring at me from the darkness. Every unexpected sound made me jump, half expecting to see the Nakut somehow keeping pace with my RV. I drove straight through, stopping only for gas and to use the restroom. I couldn't bear the thought of spending another night in the wilderness, even in the relative safety of a crowded campground or RV park. I needed to be home, surrounded by the comforting sounds of the city. It was well past midnight when I finally pulled into my driveway in the suburbs of Denver. The streetlights cast a warm, reassuring glow, and the distant hum of traffic was music to my ears. I was safe. I was home. But as I lay in bed that night staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The world seemed darker now, filled with shadows I had never noticed before. Every creak of the house settling, every rustle of wind through the trees outside my window, set my nerves on edge. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with nightmares. I dreamed of running through endless dark forests, always with the sense of something large and terrible right behind me, its hot breath on the back of my neck. The next few weeks were difficult. I went through the motions of my daily life, going to work, buying groceries, watching TV, but it all felt somehow hollow. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning crowds for a glimpse of something inhuman. I avoided parks and wooded areas, and even the potted plant in my office made me uneasy. I thought about telling someone, my daughter, a friend, a therapist, but Clyde's warning always stopped me. Who would believe me? And what if talking about it somehow summoned the Nakut, drew its attention to me even here, hundreds of miles from its hunting grounds? So I kept silent, carrying the weight of my secret alone. I threw myself into my work, taking on extra projects and longer hours. Anything to keep my mind occupied, to exhaust myself so thoroughly that I just might be able to sleep without dreaming. Months passed. Slowly, gradually, the constant fear began to fade. Not disappear. I don't think it will ever fully go away. But it became manageable. I could go days without thinking about what had happened in Pinedale. I even managed to take a vacation with my daughter and her family, though I insisted on a beach destination. No forests for me, not ever again. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind is just right, I think I can hear a low, rumbling growl in the distance. And in those moments I remember Clyde's words, "Once it gets your scent, it doesn't forget." I wonder, in my darkest moments, if the Nalkut is out there somewhere, patiently waiting. I wonder if one day, years or even decades from now, I'll look out my window and see a pair of glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. And I wonder, with a mixture of dread and strange anticipation, what will happen when that day comes. It's been over 2 decades since my encounter at Fremont Lake. I'm an old man now, retired from the accounting firm where I spent most of my career. My daughter Emily and her family have moved closer to Denver to help care for me in my twilight years. Life has moved on. The world has changed. But the memory of those few terrifying days in Wyoming has never left me. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, coloring how I see the world. I've never gone camping again. Never set foot in a national park, or even a heavily wooded city park. My family thinks it's because of my age, or maybe some traumatic event I've never shared with them. They're right about the latter, I suppose, but not in the way they imagine. I've kept my promise to Clyde. I've never told anyone about the Nalkut or what I saw in those woods. Sometimes I'm tempted, when I see reports of mysterious disappearances in national parks, or hear campfire stories about strange creatures in the wilderness. But I hold my tongue. It's safer that way, for everyone. But now, as I feel the weight of my years and sense the approach of my final days, I feel compelled to record what happened. Not for fame or notoriety. This account will stay hidden away until long after I'm gone. No, I write this as a warning. A caution to those who might stumble upon the secrets hidden in the quiet towns and deep forests of this vast country. There are things out there in the wild places of the world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, watching and waiting. The Nalkut is real as the scars it's left on my psyche, and I fear it's not alone. So to you, unknown reader of the future, I leave this account. Take it as you will, the ramblings of a frightened old man, or the sober warning of one who has seen behind the veil of our comfortable reality. But remember this, the wilderness is vast, and we know far less about it than we care to admit. Be careful out there. Watch the shadows. And if you ever find yourself near Pinedale, Wyoming, stay far, far away from Fremont Lake. Some secrets are best left undisturbed. William Johnson, Denver, Colorado, October 3rd, 2024. My name is Robert Smith, and I am 72 years old. What I'm about to recount happened to me on September 17, 1993, a date forever etched in my memory. It was supposed to be just another ordinary weekend camping trip in my RV, something I did often to escape the relentless hustle of my job in Chicago. Little did I know that this particular trip would change my life forever. I remember waking up early that Friday morning, the cool autumn air seeping through my bedroom window. At 41 years old, I was in the prime of my life, a successful marketing executive with a corner office overlooking the Chicago skyline. But the corporate world had begun to wear on me, and these weekend getaways had become my lifeline, a way to reconnect with nature and find some peace. I packed my trusty 1985 Winnebago, a 26-foot behemoth that had been my faithful companion on countless adventures. As I loaded up my fishing gear, camping supplies, and enough food to last the weekend, I felt the familiar excitement building. This time, my destination was a secluded spot near the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. The drive from Chicago to Pennsylvania was long but pleasant. I took my time, enjoying the changing landscape as urban sprawl gave way to rolling hills and dense forests. The leaves were just beginning to turn, splashing the countryside with hints of gold and crimson. I stopped at a small diner in Ohio for lunch, savoring a hearty plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes while chatting with the friendly waitress about local attractions. As the sun began to dip low on the horizon, I finally approached my destination. This place wasn't on any major map, just a secluded nook I'd stumbled upon by accident years ago during one of my aimless wanderings. It had a small clearing by a creek, surrounded by dense trees, perfect for some quiet contemplation. I carefully maneuvered the RV down the narrow dirt road, branches scraping against the sides as I pushed deeper into the forest. The fading daylight filtered through the canopy, casting long shadows across my path. After about a mile, the trees opened up to reveal the familiar clearing. With a sigh of contentment, I parked the RV and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The air was crisp and filled with the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. The babbling of the nearby creek provided a soothing backdrop as I began to set up camp. I unfurled my favorite outdoor rug in front of the RV, creating a small patio area. Next came the folding table and chairs, my portable propane grill, and a stack of firewood I'd brought along. As I worked, I couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in my little home away from home. The Winnebago might not have been the newest or fanciest RV out there, but it was mine, and it represented freedom. With camp set up, I decided to take a short hike before it got too dark. I grabbed my walking stick and a small backpack with some water and trail mix, then set off down a faint path leading deeper into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds settling in for the night and small animals scurrying through the underbrush. As I walked, I let my mind wander, thinking about my life back in Chicago. My job was demanding, often requiring long hours and high-stress meetings. I was good at what I did, but lately I'd been feeling unfulfilled. These camping trips were becoming more than just a hobby. They were a lifeline, a glimpse of a simpler existence that I found myself craving more and more. I returned to camp just as the last rays of sunlight were disappearing behind the trees. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I shivered slightly as I set about building a fire. Soon the crackling flames cast a warm glow across the clearing, and I settled into my chair with a contented sigh. Dinner that night was simple but satisfying. A can of beef stew heated over the fire, accompanied by a couple of slices of crusty bread I'd picked up at a bakery on the way. As I ate, I gazed up at the night sky, marveling at the countless stars visible here, far from the light pollution of the city. After dinner, I cleaned up and secured the campsite, making sure all food was safely stored in the RV to avoid attracting any curious wildlife. I then retreated to the comfort of my Winnebago, settling in with a dog-eared paperback I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. As I read, I could hear the gentle sounds of the forest outside, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant yip of a coyote. It was a peaceful symphony that soon lulled me into a deep, dreamless sleep. Little did I know that this peaceful beginning was merely the calm before the storm. The events that would unfold over the next 24 hours would challenge everything I thought I knew about the world and leave me forever changed. I awoke early the next morning, just as the first rays of sunlight were beginning to filter through the trees. The air inside the RV was chilly, and I could see my breath as I fumbled for my glasses on the nightstand. I pulled on a warm fleece and my favorite pair of well-worn hiking boots before stepping outside to greet the day. The clearing was shrouded in a light mist, giving it an almost ethereal quality. Dew clung to every surface, sparkling like diamonds in the early morning light. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, clean air, and felt a sense of peace wash over me. After a quick breakfast of instant oatmeal and strong black coffee, I grabbed my fishing gear and headed down to the creek. The water was clear and cold, rushing over smooth stones and creating small eddies where I knew the fish liked to hide. I found a comfortable spot on the bank and cast my line, settling in for a morning of quiet contemplation. As I fished, I let my mind wander. I thought about my life back in Chicago, the pressures of work, the constant noise and hustle of the city. Out here, surrounded by nature, those concerns seemed distant and insignificant. I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what it would be like to leave it all behind and embrace a simpler life. The hours slipped by almost unnoticed. By midday I had caught 2 decent-sized trout, which I cleaned and stored in the RV's small refrigerator for dinner. Feeling invigorated by my success, I decided to spend the afternoon exploring the surrounding forest. I packed a small day pack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit, then set off down one of the faint trails leading away from the clearing. The forest was dense, with towering oak and maple trees creating a canopy high above. Shafts of sunlight broke through here and there, illuminating patches of ferns and wildflowers on the forest floor. As I hiked, I kept my eyes and ears open for signs of wildlife. I spotted several deer tracks in the soft earth, and even caught a glimpse of a red fox darting through the underbrush. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and small animals, a constant reminder of the vibrant ecosystem surrounding me. About 2 miles from camp, I came across a small hidden waterfall. The stream tumbled down a series of rocky ledges, creating a mesmerizing display of rushing water and mist. I sat on a moss-covered log nearby, pulling out my notepad to sketch the scene. I wasn't much of an artist, but I enjoyed trying to capture the beauty of the natural world in my own clumsy way. As the afternoon wore on, I made my way back to camp, taking a different route to explore more of the area. The forest seemed to change character as the day progressed, shadows lengthening and the ambient sounds shifting as diurnal creatures bedded down and nocturnal ones began to stir. I arrived back at the clearing just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across my campsite. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I quickly set about building a fire. Soon, the crackling flames cast a warm glow across the area, pushing back the encroaching darkness. Dinner that night was a feast by camping standards. I pan-fried the trout I had caught earlier, seasoning them with lemon and herbs I had brought from home. Alongside, I prepared some instant mashed potatoes and opened a can of green beans. As I sat by the fire, savoring my meal and sipping a cold beer, I felt a deep sense of contentment. After dinner, I cleaned up, making sure to store all food securely in the RV to avoid attracting animals. Then I settled into my folding chair by the fire, gazing up at the star-filled sky. Out here, away from the light pollution of the city, the Milky Way was clearly visible, a river of stars stretching across the heavens. As the fire burned down to embers, I found myself reflecting on the day. It had been perfect in its simplicity, fishing, hiking, enjoying nature. I thought about my job back in Chicago, the stress and pressure that seemed to consume my life. Out here, none of that mattered. I felt a pang of regret at the thought of returning to that world in just a couple of days. Little did I know that my peaceful reverie was about to be shattered. As I sat there, lost in thought, I had no idea that in just a few short hours, my life would take a turn into the realm of the unexplainable and terrifying. It was around midnight when I first heard it, a rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, I dismissed it as nothing unusual, probably just a raccoon or a deer moving through the underbrush. The forest was full of nocturnal creatures, after all. I took another sip of my beer, enjoying the last remnants of warmth from the dying fire. But then I heard something else, a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was a low, distinct gurgling noise, unlike any animal I recognized. It sounded almost human, but distorted, as if someone was trying to speak through water. I sat up straighter in my chair, all senses suddenly on high alert. The gurgling sound came again, louder this time, and accompanied by the cracking of twigs as if something was moving through the forest towards me. My first thought was that someone might be in trouble. Perhaps a hiker had fallen into the creek and was struggling to call for help. Despite the growing sense of unease in the pit of my stomach, I knew I couldn't ignore a potential cry for help. I grabbed my flashlight from the table next to me, its weight reassuring in my hand. The beam cut through the darkness as I swung it towards the source of the sound, illuminating the underbrush and the trees beyond my campsite. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet forest. "Is anyone there? Do you need help?" There was no answer, just that persistent gurgling sound. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the creek, about 20 yards from where I stood. I took a deep breath, stealing my nerves, and started walking towards it. The forest seemed different at night. Familiar landmarks transformed into looming shadows. My flashlight beam bounced off tree trunks and undergrowth, creating a tunnel of light through the darkness. With each step, the gurgling grew louder, interspersed now with a wet, slapping sound that I couldn't identify. As I approached the creek, my light fell upon something that made me stop in my tracks. There, half submerged in the shallow water, was a small, overturned canoe. It was old and covered in moss, something I had never noticed during my daytime explorations of the area. I stepped closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The canoe looked like it had been there for years, its wood weathered and beginning to rot. But if that was the case, how had I never seen it before? As I stood there trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the gurgling sound stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was even more unnerving than the noise had been. I swung my flashlight around wildly, half expecting to see an injured hiker or some lost camper emerging from the trees. But there was nothing, just the quiet creek and the dense darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Something felt wrong, deeply and fundamentally wrong. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get back to the safety of my RV. I started to turn, intending to do just that, when I caught a glimpse of movement in the corner of my eye. I swung the flashlight quickly in that direction, but whatever it was had vanished. All I saw was the shifting shadows of leaves in the breeze. That was enough for me. I turned and began walking quickly back towards my campsite, trying to keep my pace steady despite the urge to break into a run. The forest seemed to close in around me, branches reaching out like grasping fingers, shadows deepening and shifting in ways that didn't seem natural. When I finally reached the clearing, I was out of breath, my heart racing. The campfire had burned down to just a few glowing embers, casting an eerie, faint light across the site. Without hesitation, I headed straight for my RV, locking the door behind me as soon as I was inside. I sat down heavily on the small sofa, trying to calm my ragged breathing. What had just happened? Was I letting my imagination run wild, spooked by unfamiliar sounds in the dark? Or had there really been something out there, something that didn't belong in these woods? As I sat there replaying the events in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every creak of the RV settling, every rustle of leaves outside sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Sleep, I knew, would be a long time coming. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The true terror of that night in the Allegheny National Forest was yet to unfold, and by the time dawn broke, my entire understanding of reality would be shaken to its core. Despite my racing thoughts and the lingering sense of unease, exhaustion eventually caught up with me. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew I was jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold, a rhythmic thumping on the side of the RV. At first, in my groggy state, I thought it might be a branch blown by the wind, but as I became more alert, I realized the sound was too regular, too deliberate. It was almost like someone, or something, was knocking. I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding so loud I was sure it must be audible outside the RV. The knocking continued, growing louder and more insistent with each passing second. It seemed to be moving, circling the vehicle, as if whatever was out there was testing for weak points. I reached for the baseball bat I kept next to my bed for protection, its solid weight providing a small measure of comfort. With my other hand, I fumbled for my flashlight, nearly dropping it in my nervousness. The knocking stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so profound it seemed to press against my eardrums. I held my breath, straining to hear any sound from outside. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, just as I was beginning to think I had imagined it all, I heard something else. A soft scraping sound, like nails or claws dragging slowly across the metal exterior of the RV. A whimper escaped my throat before I could stop it. I clapped a hand over my mouth, irrationally afraid that whatever was out there might hear me. The scraping continued, moving from the side of the RV towards the door. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever it was to find a way in. With trembling hands, I got to my feet, gripping the baseball bat so tightly my knuckles turned white. I crept towards the door, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The scraping had stopped, but I could hear something else now, a wet, gurgling sound like the one I had heard earlier by the creek, but closer, much closer. My hand hovered over the door handle. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but open that door. But I knew I had to face whatever was out there. I couldn't spend the rest of the night jumping at every sound, imagining horrors lurking in the darkness. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the door open and swung my flashlight around wildly, the bat raised and ready to strike. The campsite was empty. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar shapes of my folding chairs, the smoldering remains of the campfire, the surrounding trees. But there was no sign of any intruder, no monstrous shape lurking in the shadows. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing, ears straining for any sound out of the ordinary. But all I could hear was the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant hooting of an owl. Just as I was about to convince myself it had all been a vivid nightmare, my flashlight beam caught something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft dirt in front of the RV, was a set of footprints. But these were unlike any footprints I had ever seen before. They were elongated, almost twice the length of a normal human foot, with strange claw-like indentations at the tips of what should have been toes. And they were fresh, the edges still crisp in the damp soil. My hands shaking, I followed the trail with my flashlight. The footprints led away from the RV, towards the creek where I had heard the strange noises earlier. Without fully realizing what I was doing, I found myself following them, drawn by a morbid curiosity that overrode my fear. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees looming overhead, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. Every shadow seemed to hide some nameless horror, every rustle of leaves a potential threat. As I approached the creek, I saw something that made me stop in my tracks. The old moss-covered canoe I had discovered earlier was no longer overturned. It sat upright at the water's edge, as if waiting for a passenger. But it wasn't the canoe that held my attention. It was the object next to it, a small leather-bound book that seemed to glow faintly in the beam of my flashlight. Against my better judgment, I approached and picked up the book. It was old, the leather cracked and worn, with strange symbols embossed on the cover that I didn't recognize from any language I knew. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with dense handwritten text in the same unfamiliar script, interspersed with drawings that made my skin crawl. There were sketches of creatures that couldn't possibly exist, things with too many limbs, distorted features, and eyes that seemed to stare out from the page with malevolent intelligence. One drawing, in particular, caught my eye. It depicted a tall, impossibly thin figure with elongated limbs and no discernible face. My breath caught in my throat as I realized the creature's feet matched the strange prints I had been following. A twig snapped behind me, and I whirled around, dropping the book in my panic. The beam of my flashlight danced wildly across the trees, but I couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. Then I heard it, that wet, gurgling sound, closer than ever before. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the reach of my light, hidden in the shadows between the trees. I backed away slowly, my eyes darting from side to side, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. My foot hit something, and I nearly fell backward into the creek. It was the book I had dropped. Without thinking, I snatched it up and turned to run back to the RV. That's when I felt it, a cold, clammy hand grasping my ankle. I screamed and kicked out instinctively, my foot connecting with something solid. The grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled away, not daring to look back. I ran through the forest, branches whipping at my face, roots threatening to trip me with every step. I could hear something moving behind me, crashing through the underbrush with inhuman speed. When I finally burst into the clearing where my RV was parked, I was gasping for breath, my lungs burning. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door locked firmly behind me. For the rest of the night I sat in the driver's seat, the baseball bat across my lap, staring out into the darkness. The knocking started again sometime before dawn, moving around the RV, tapping at each window in turn. But I didn't dare look out, afraid of what I might see pressed against the glass. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, the knocking finally stopped. I waited another hour until the sun was fully up, before I finally worked up the courage to start the engine. I tore out of that clearing like a man possessed, not stopping until I reached the small town of Warren, nearly 50 miles away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely put the RV in park. I went straight to the local sheriff's office, the leather-bound book clutched tightly to my chest. The deputy on duty listened to my story with a mix of concern and skepticism. He radioed a couple of officers to check out the campsite, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. Whatever had been there, I was certain it wouldn't have left any evidence behind. Sure enough, when the deputies returned, they reported finding nothing out of the ordinary. No footprints, no overturned canoe, no signs of any disturbance. They suggested it might have been a vivid nightmare brought on by spending the night alone in the woods. But I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. And I had the book as proof, its weight a constant reminder that the events of that night were all too real. I didn't go camping again for a long time after that. When I finally did, it was in well-populated campgrounds, surrounded by other people. But I never felt truly safe in the woods again. In the years that followed, I did extensive research into the area where I had camped. I discovered old legends about a creature known as the Pale Wanderer, said to haunt the forests of Pennsylvania. The descriptions matched what I had seen, a tall, emaciated figure with unnaturally long limbs and a face hidden in shadow. The book remained in my possession, a constant source of fascination and dread. I had it analyzed by experts in ancient languages and cryptography, but no one could decipher its contents. The symbols seemed to shift and change when examined too closely, and several researchers reported vivid nightmares after prolonged exposure to the text. Now, nearly 3 decades later, I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, the memory of that gurgling sound echoing in my ears. I've long since moved to the city, trading the quiet of nature for the comforting buzz of constant human activity. But sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of damp earth and decaying leaves, and for a moment, I'm back in those woods, with something unnatural lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I don't know if what I encountered that night was some undiscovered creature, a ghost, or something beyond human understanding. But I do know this. There are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the dark corners of the wilderness, waiting for unwary travelers to stumble upon them. And if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, hearing strange noises in the night, remember my story. Because sometimes the monsters in the dark are all too real. As I sit here in my apartment in downtown Chicago, the leather-bound book rests on my desk, a constant reminder of that fateful night. I've often thought about destroying it, burning it to ashes and scattering them to the wind, but something always stops me. Perhaps it's the fear that destroying the book might somehow summon whatever creature it's connected to. Or maybe it's the lingering hope that one day I'll uncover its secrets and finally understand what happened to me. I've never shared the full story publicly before now. Who would believe me? A 72-year-old man spinning tales of monsters in the woods? But I feel compelled to record it now, to pass on this warning to others who might venture into the dark places of the world. To this day, I can't explain everything that happened during those terrifying hours in the Allegheny National Forest. Was it all real, or some sort of hallucination brought on by isolation and fear? The rational part of my mind wants to dismiss it, to file it away as a bad dream or a trick of the light. But then I look at the book, its cover still unmarked by age despite the decades that have passed, and I know the truth. There are things in this world beyond our understanding, creatures that exist in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. So if you're reading this, take heed. The next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange noise in the night, don't dismiss it. Don't go investigating. And if you hear a wet, gurgling sound like someone trying to speak through water, run. Run as fast and as far as you can, because the Pale Wanderer is out there, waiting in the shadows, and not everyone who encounters it lives to tell the tale. My name is Richard Brown, and I am 68 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on September 12, 1983, when I was 35 years old. It's a story I've carried with me for over 3 decades, one that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I recall those fateful days in the Bitterroot National Forest of Montana. It was the autumn of 1983, and my life felt like it was falling apart at the seams. I had just finalized my divorce from Sarah, my wife of 10 years. We had married young, straight out of college, full of dreams and ambitions, but as the years went by, we grew apart, our lives taking different paths. The divorce was amicable, but it left me feeling hollow, questioning every decision I'd ever made. I was working as a high school English teacher in Missoula at the time. The new school year had just begun, but I couldn't shake the feeling of emptiness that had settled over me. One Friday afternoon, after the last bell had rung and the hallways had emptied, I found myself sitting alone in my classroom, staring at the faded posters of Shakespeare and Hemingway on the walls. It was then that I made a spontaneous decision. I needed to get away, to clear my head and figure out what to do next with my life. I owned an old RV, a 1975 Winnebago Brave that I had bought on a whim a few years back, dreaming of family road trips that never quite materialized. It had been sitting in our, now my, driveway for months, gathering dust and serving as a constant reminder of unfulfilled plans. But now, it seemed like the perfect escape vehicle. That evening I packed up some clothes, basic supplies, and my fishing gear. I left a note for my sister Karen, letting her know I was taking a short trip to the Bitterroot National Forest. "Don't worry," I wrote. "I just need some time to think. I'll be back in a week." Little did I know how that week would change my life forever. The next morning I set out early, the sun just beginning to peek over the eastern horizon as I pulled out of Missoula. The drive to the Bitterroot National Forest took about 2 hours, the scenery gradually changing from the urban sprawl of Missoula to the rugged beauty of western Montana. I drove past small towns like Lolo and Florence, watching as the Bitterroot Mountains loomed larger on the horizon. I had chosen the Bitterroot National Forest for its relative obscurity. While places like Glacier National Park drew crowds of tourists, the Bitterroot was quieter, wilder. It was a place where I could truly be alone with my thoughts. As I drove deeper into the forest, following winding roads that seemed to grow narrower with each passing mile, I felt a sense of anticipation building in my chest. The towering pines and firs created a canopy overhead, dappling the road with shadows. The air grew cooler, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was late afternoon by the time I found a suitable clearing to set up camp. I maneuvered the RV off the main road, following a rough trail until I reached a small meadow surrounded by dense forest. A babbling stream ran along one edge of the clearing, promising good fishing prospects. I parked the RV and stepped outside, taking a deep breath of the crisp mountain air. The silence was almost overwhelming after the constant hum of city life. Here the only sounds were the rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant calls of birds. As I began to set up camp, my mind wandered back to the events that had led me here. I thought about Sarah, wondering what she was doing at that moment. Was she also trying to find her way in this new separate life we had chosen? I shook my head, trying to clear away these thoughts. I was here to forget, at least for a while. I spent the remaining daylight hours setting up a small campfire pit and gathering firewood. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink, I fired up the RV's small propane stove and grilled a couple of hot dogs. It wasn't much of a dinner, but out here, with the scent of pine and wood smoke in the air, it tasted better than any fancy restaurant meal. After dinner I sat by the fire, nursing a beer and watching as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The Milky Way stretched across the heavens, a sight I had almost forgotten existed after years of living under city lights. As I sat there, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. Maybe this trip was exactly what I needed. That first night passed uneventfully. I slept soundly in the RV, lulled by the gentle sounds of the forest. When I awoke the next morning, I felt refreshed and ready to explore my surroundings. After a simple breakfast of instant coffee and granola bars, I decided to spend the day hiking and fishing. I packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, and my fishing gear. As an afterthought, I scribbled a note and left it on the RV's small dining table. Gone hiking and fishing, following the stream to the east, back by sunset. Richard. It seemed silly, leaving a note when there was no one around to read it, but old habits die hard. The day was perfect for hiking, cool but not cold, with a light breeze that kept the mosquitoes at bay. I followed the stream that ran past my campsite, marveling at the beauty of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dazzling patterns on the forest floor. The undergrowth was thick in places, forcing me to push through ferns and berry bushes. As I hiked, I found my mind wandering to the future. What did I want to do with my life now? Should I stay in Missoula, or was it time for a fresh start somewhere new? The questions that had seemed so overwhelming back in the city now felt more manageable, as if the forest air had cleared my mind as well as my lungs. By early afternoon, I had hiked several miles upstream. The terrain had grown steeper, with the stream now tumbling over rocky cascades. It was here that I decided to try my luck at fishing. I found a promising pool below a small waterfall and set up my gear. Fishing had always been a form of meditation for me. The repetitive motion of casting, the focus required to watch for any movement in the water, it all served to quiet my racing thoughts. Time seemed to slow down as I stood there, my line drifting in the clear mountain water. After about an hour, I had caught 2 decent-sized trout. It was more than enough for dinner, so I packed up my gear and began the hike back to camp. As I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming earlier, now felt watchful. I brushed it off, as my imagination running wild after too many hours alone. It was late afternoon by the time I made it back to the clearing where I had parked the RV. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the meadow. As I approached my campsite, a strange scent caught my attention. It was faint, but unmistakable. A sickly sweet odor that reminded me of rotting meat. My first thought was that some animal had died nearby. It wasn't uncommon in the wilderness, after all, but as I got closer to the RV, the smell grew stronger, and a sense of unease began to creep over me. Something was wrong. The RV's door, which I distinctly remembered closing and locking before I left, now stood ajar. My heart began to race as I approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is someone there?" There was no response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. With shaking hands, I pushed the door open wider and peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The interior of the RV was a disaster. It looked as if a whirlwind had torn through the small space. Cabinets were flung open, their contents strewn across the floor. The cushions of the small dinette were shredded, stuffing spilling out like some grotesque parody of snow. But it was the walls and floor that truly horrified me. A dark, viscous substance was smeared across every surface. It looked like blood, but thicker, almost black in the fading light. The smell that had caught my attention earlier was overwhelming now, a stench of decay that made me gag. I stumbled backward out of the RV, my mind reeling. What could have done this? A bear, maybe? But I had never heard of a bear behaving like this, and the destruction seemed almost deliberate. As the initial shock wore off, I forced myself to think rationally. I needed to assess the damage, salvage what I could, and get out of there. Whatever had done this might still be nearby. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and re-entered the RV. I grabbed my backpack, which thankfully had been in the cab and was untouched, and began shoving whatever useful supplies I could find into it. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every sound from the forest outside made me jump. It was as I was zipping up the now full backpack that I heard it, a rustling sound from just beyond the clearing. I froze, straining my ears. There it was again, closer this time, accompanied by a sound I can only describe as a low melodic whistle. My heart pounding, I peered out the RV's window. The sun had set, leaving the forest shrouded in twilight shadows. At first I saw nothing. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the underbrush at the edge of the clearing. I caught a glimpse of a hunched shape, too tall and thin to be a bear. Panic seized me. I needed to get out of there, now. But the thing, whatever it was between me and the road. My only option was to hunker down in the RV and hope it would leave. I quickly closed and locked the door, then turned on every light in the RV. The sudden brightness was jarring after the gathering darkness outside. I grabbed my hunting knife from my pack. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing, and sat at the small table, my eyes fixed on the door. The night that followed was the longest of my life. Every creak of the RV's frame, every whisper of wind outside, sent a fresh wave of terror through me. Several times I heard that eerie whistling sound, sometimes close, sometimes farther away, as if the thing was circling the clearing. At some point, exhaustion must have overtaken me, because I jerked awake to the sound of scratching at the door. It was a deliberate sound, slow and rhythmic, like something testing the strength of the barrier between us. I sat there, knife clutched in my sweating hand, barely breathing as I listened to the scratching. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The rest of the night passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I don't think I slept again, every nerve in my body on high alert. When the first light of dawn finally began to filter through the windows, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I had made it through the night. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly, I cautiously opened the RV's door and peered outside. The clearing looked peaceful in the early morning light, with no sign of the terror that had gripped me during the night. The air was crisp and clean, the foul odor from the previous evening completely gone. I stepped outside, scanning the area for any signs of what had happened. To my amazement, there were no tracks, no broken branches, nothing to indicate that anything had been there. If it weren't for the destroyed interior of the RV, I might have thought I had imagined the whole thing. Not wanting to stick around to find out if the creature, whatever it was, would return, I quickly packed up what I could and prepared to leave. As I was doing a final check of the campsite, something caught my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing where I had first seen the shape the night before, was a small tuft of something. I approached cautiously and bent down to examine it. It looked like fur, but unlike any I had ever seen. It was coarse and wiry, with an oily sheen that seemed to shift colors in the morning light. I hesitated for a moment, then pulled out a small plastic bag from my pack and carefully placed the tuft inside. If nothing else, it was proof that I hadn't imagined everything. With one last look around the clearing, I climbed into the RV and started the engine. As I drove down the winding forest road, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see something loping after the RV. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. It was mid-morning by the time I reached the small town of Darby, the first sign of civilization since I had entered the forest. My nerves were shot, and I desperately needed fuel, both for the RV and for myself. I pulled into a small gas station on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. As I was filling up the RV, the station attendant came out to check on me. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with a weathered face and kind eyes. His name tag read Frank. "You all right there, son?" he asked, his voice gravelly but concerned. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I must have looked a sight exhausted, disheveled, and probably wild-eyed with fear and lack of sleep. For a moment I considered brushing off his concern with some vague explanation, but something in his expression made me pause. He looked understanding, as if he had seen this before. I'm not sure," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Something happened up in the forest, something I can't explain." Frank's expression grew serious. He glanced around as if making sure no one else was within earshot, then said in a low voice, "Why don't you come inside? Looks like you could use a cup of coffee, and maybe we can talk about what happened." I nodded gratefully, finished filling up the RV, and followed Frank into the small convenience store attached to the gas station. He gestured for me to sit at a small table in the corner while he poured 2 cups of coffee from an ancient-looking percolator. As we sat there, the aroma of strong black coffee filling the air, I found myself pouring out the whole story. I told Frank about the destroyed RV, the strange smells, the noises in the night, and the glimpse I had caught of something in the forest. To his credit, Frank listened without interruption, his face growing more grave with each detail. When I finished, Frank sat back in his chair, a thoughtful look on his face. "You're not the first to come down from those woods with a story like that," he said finally. "Folks around here, they call it the Whistler." "The Whistler?" I repeated, a chill running down my spine at the name. Frank nodded. "Been stories about it for generations. Some say it's a spirit, others think it's some kind of animal that hasn't been discovered yet. All I know is that people have gone missing up there over the years. Hikers, campers, even a few locals who should have known better. I sat there trying to process what Frank was telling me. Part of me wanted to dismiss it as local superstition, but after what I had experienced, I couldn't simply brush it off. What do you think it is? I asked hesitantly. Frank shrugged. Wish I knew. All I can tell you is to count yourself lucky. Not everyone who encounters the Whistler comes back to tell the tale. We sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of Frank's words hanging in the air between us. Finally, he spoke again. Look, I know a fella who might be able to tell you more. Name's Tom Jenkins. He's something of a local expert on the forest and its oddities. If you're interested, I could give him a call, see if he'd be willing to talk to you. I hesitated. Part of me wanted nothing more than to get in the RV and drive as far away from this place as possible. But another part, the part that had always been drawn to mysteries and unanswered questions, was intrigued. Maybe this Tom Jenkins could provide some answers, some explanation for what I had experienced. Yeah, I said finally. Yeah, I'd like to talk to him. Frank nodded, seeming unsurprised by my decision. He got up and went to the store's ancient rotary phone, dialing a number from memory. I could hear him speaking in low tones, though I couldn't make out the words. After a few minutes, he came back to the table. Tom says he can meet you this afternoon if you're up for it. He's got a cabin just outside of town. I can give you directions if you want. I nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation, and Frank gave me directions to Tom Jenkins's cabin, a hand-drawn map on the back of an old receipt. I thanked him for his help and the coffee, then set out. The drive took about 30 minutes, winding through back roads that grew progressively more remote. Finally, I turned onto a narrow dirt track that led to a small clearing. Tom's cabin was a sturdy-looking structure of rough-hewn logs, with a porch that wrapped around two sides. Smoke curled from the chimney, and I could see a figure moving behind the windows. As I parked the RV, the cabin's door opened, and a man stepped out. Tom Jenkins was not what I had expected. In my mind, I had pictured a grizzled old mountain man. Instead, I was greeted by a man probably in his late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a neatly trimmed beard. He was dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt, looking more like a college professor than a backwoods expert. "You must be Richard," he called out as I approached. Frank called ahead, said you had quite a story to tell. We shook hands, and Tom invited me inside. The cabin's interior was cozy but cluttered, every surface covered with books, maps, and what looked like scientific equipment. He gestured for me to sit in an worn armchair while he busied himself making tea. Once we were settled, mugs of steaming tea in hand, Tom leaned forward, his eyes intense. "So, tell me what happened up there in the forest." I recounted my experience again, trying to remember every detail. Tom listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification, but otherwise remaining silent. When I finished, he sat back, a thoughtful expression on his face. "You're not crazy, Richard," he said finally. "What you encountered up there, well, it's something I've been studying for years." "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom sighed. "Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. But I can tell you what I do know." He got up and went to a large map of the Bitterroot National Forest pinned to one wall. Red pins dotted various locations. "Each of these pins represents a reported sighting or encounter," he explained. "They go back decades. Whatever this thing is, it's been in these woods for a long time." He turned back to me. "The locals call it the Whistler, as I'm sure Frank told you. From the accounts I've gathered, it seems to be some kind of creature, possibly not of this world. It's attracted to certain people, certain places. No one knows why." "But what does it want?" I asked. Tom shook his head. "That's the million-dollar question. Some think it's hunting, others believe it's collecting, studying us maybe. All I know is that people have disappeared over the years. Not many and not often enough to raise major alarms, but enough to create a pattern." He paused, seeming to debate whether to continue. "There's something else," he said finally. "Something I haven't shared with many people. I've found artifacts, things left behind after encounters." My hand went to my pocket, where I had stored the bag containing the strange fur I had found. "Like this?" I asked, pulling it out. Tom's eyes widened as he took the bag. He examined the contents closely, his expression a mix of excitement and concern. Yes, exactly like this. Where did you find it? I told him about the tuft of fur at the edge of the clearing. Tom nodded, his mind clearly racing. This is incredible, he murmured. I've never had a sample this fresh before. We spent the next few hours discussing the Whistler, with Tom sharing some of the other stories he had collected over the years. As the afternoon wore on, I found myself drawn into the mystery. Despite my fear, I couldn't help but be fascinated by the idea that there was something out there, something unknown to science. As the sun began to set, Tom looked at me with a serious expression. Richard, I know this might sound crazy, but would you be willing to go back up there with me, to the spot where you had your encounter? I hesitated. The thought of returning to that clearing filled me with dread, but at the same time I felt a pull, a need to understand what had happened to me. When? I asked. Tomorrow, Tom replied. We'll go prepared this time. I have some equipment that might help us gather more information. I took a deep breath, weighing my options. Finally, I nodded. Okay, I said, let's do it. The next morning dawned clear and cold. I had spent the night in my RV parked outside Tom's cabin. Despite the lingering fear from my experience, I had slept soundly, exhaustion finally catching up with me. Tom was already up when I emerged from the RV, loading gear into an old Jeep. He had an assortment of scientific equipment, cameras, audio recorders, and some devices I didn't recognize. He also had 2 rifles, which he assured me were just precautionary. We set out just after sunrise, the Jeep bouncing along the rough forest roads. As we drove, Tom explained more about his research. He had been studying the Whistler phenomenon for over a decade, ever since his own encounter in these woods. He had never seen the creature clearly, but like me, he had experienced its presence. The government knows about it, he told me as we drove deeper into the forest. Or at least some parts of the government do, but they've kept it quiet. Can you imagine the panic if people knew there was something out here, something we can't explain? I nodded, understanding the logic, but feeling uneasy about the secrecy. As we neared the area where I had camped, that feeling of unease grew stronger. The forest seemed different in the daylight, less menacing, but no less mysterious. We parked the Jeep a short distance from my original campsite and proceeded on foot. Tom moved with the quiet confidence of someone familiar with the wilderness, his eyes constantly scanning our surroundings. I felt clumsy and exposed in comparison, every snapping twig under my feet sounding like a gunshot in the quiet forest. As we entered the clearing where I had parked my RV, I felt a chill run down my spine. Everything looked normal. There were no signs of the destruction I had witnessed, no lingering smell of decay. If I hadn't lived through it myself, I would have thought it was just another peaceful spot in the woods. Tom immediately set to work, setting up cameras and other equipment around the perimeter of the clearing. He took samples of soil and vegetation, carefully bagging and labeling each one. I helped where I could, but mostly I just watched, still trying to reconcile the peaceful scene before me with the terror of that night. As the day wore on, nothing out of the ordinary happened. We heard the usual forest sounds, birds calling, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, but nothing that suggested the presence of something larger or more sinister. It was late afternoon when things changed. I was helping Tom adjust one of his cameras when I felt it, a sudden drop in temperature, as if all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. Tom felt it too. I saw him stiffen, his hand going to the rifle slung over his shoulder. Then we heard it, that low, eerie whistle that had haunted my dreams since that night. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the trees. "Get ready," Tom whispered, his voice tense. "It's coming." We stood back to back in the center of the clearing, weapons at the ready. The whistling grew louder, closer. The forest had gone completely silent, as if every living thing was holding its breath. Suddenly there was movement at the edge of the clearing. Something large and dark detached itself from the shadows of the trees. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost gliding across the ground. As it entered the clearing, I got my first clear look at the Whistler. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but much taller and thinner than any person. Its body seemed to shimmer, as if it wasn't quite solid. But it was the face, or rather the lack of one, that truly terrified me. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless expanse, like a mask made of shadow. Tom was shouting something, but I couldn't make out the words over the pounding of blood in my ears. The creature, the whistler, turned its eyeless face toward us. The whistling sound grew to a deafening pitch. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. I remember Tom firing his rifle, the sound impossibly loud in the confined space of the clearing. The whistler moved with incredible speed, closing the distance between us in the blink of an eye. I felt something brush past me, a sensation of intense cold that seemed to penetrate to my very bones. Then Tom was on the ground, the whistler looming over him. Without thinking, I raised my own rifle and fired. The creature recoiled, making a sound like tearing metal. It turned its attention to me, and for a moment I was certain I was going to die. But then, as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the shadows of the forest. The silence that followed was deafening. I rushed to Tom's side, fearing the worst, but he was alive, though badly shaken. We gathered our equipment as quickly as we could and fled the clearing, not stopping until we reached the Jeep. The drive back to Tom's cabin was tense and silent. We were both trying to process what we had seen, what we had experienced. It wasn't until we were safely inside, doors locked and a fire blazing in the hearth, that we began to talk. "It's real," Tom kept saying, his voice a mix of fear and excitement. "After all these years, we finally have proof." But as we reviewed the footage from the cameras and analyzed the data from Tom's equipment, we realized that our proof was frustratingly inconclusive. The cameras had malfunctioned at the crucial moment, leaving us with only brief glimpses of movement and shadow. The audio recordings captured the whistling sound, but little else. We had experienced something extraordinary, something that defied explanation, but we had no way to prove it to the world. In the years since that day in the Bitterroot National Forest, I've often questioned my memories of what happened. Did we really encounter something unknown to science, something potentially not of this world? Or was it all some kind of shared delusion, born of fear and suggestion? Tom Jenkins continued his research, becoming something of a local legend in the process. He published papers and gave lectures, but without concrete proof, his theories were largely dismissed by the scientific community. As for me, I left Montana shortly after our encounter. The experience had shaken me to my core, making me question everything I thought I knew about the world. I traveled for a while, trying to find some sense of normalcy, before eventually settling in a small town on the Oregon coast. I never went camping again. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind blows in from the sea, I think I hear a faint whistling sound. It's probably just the wind, I tell myself, but a part of me wonders, is the whistler out there still, roaming the dark places of the world? And if it is, what does it want? I don't have answers to these questions. All I know is that there are things in this world that we don't understand, things that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception, and sometimes, if we're not careful, we might just catch a glimpse of them. So if you find yourself in the wilds of Montana, in the shadows of the Bitterroot Mountains, and you hear a strange whistling on the wind, my advice is to turn around and leave. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. My name is Charles Williams, and I am 74 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened to me on August 18, 1996, but the memory of it is as fresh as if it were yesterday. I've spent nearly 3 decades trying to make sense of what occurred during those fateful days in the forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Even now, as I put pen to paper, I can feel my heart racing and my palms growing clammy. But I feel compelled to share this story, if only to warn others who might venture into those woods, unprepared for what lurks in the shadows. I had just retired from a long stint as a high school math teacher. 35 years of equations, proofs, and teenage drama had left me yearning for something different, something wild. I'd always dreamed of exploring the vast forests of Michigan's Upper Peninsula, and with my newfound freedom, I decided it was time to make that dream a reality. My trusty RV, a 1985 Winnebago Chieftain that I'd lovingly restored over the years, seemed like the perfect vehicle for this adventure. I spent weeks preparing for the trip, stocking up on supplies, poring over maps, and making sure every system in the old girl was in working order. As the departure date drew near, I felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. There was something about the idea of being alone in the wilderness that both thrilled and unnerved me. It was during one of my final preparation sessions that I received an unexpected call. The gruff, familiar voice on the other end belonged to Carl Emerson, my old college roommate and longtime friend. We hadn't spoken in months, maybe even a year, but Carl had a way of picking up right where we left off. "Chuck, you old dog," he bellowed through the phone. "Word on the street is you're planning a little excursion up north. Room for one more?" I hesitated for a moment. Carl and I had been close once, but time and distance had taken their toll. He'd always been a bit of a wild card, prone to impulsive decisions and reckless behavior. But there was also a part of me that missed his energy, his zest for life. And if I was being honest with myself, the idea of facing the wilderness alone was becoming increasingly daunting. "Sure, Carl," I found myself saying. "Why not? It'll be like old times." Carl's booming laugh filled the line. "Hot damn, I'll be there tomorrow. We're going to paint that peninsula red, my friend." As I hung up the phone, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd made the right decision. Carl's presence would certainly make the trip more lively, but would it also invite chaos? Only time would tell. True to his word, Carl showed up on my doorstep the next morning, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder and his old Gibson guitar case in the other hand. His salt and pepper hair was longer than I remembered, tied back in a loose ponytail, and his face was weathered by years of outdoor living. But his eyes still held that mischievous glint I remembered from our college days. "Ready to raise some hell, Chuck?" he grinned, pulling me into a bear hug. I couldn't help but smile. "It's Charles now, Carl, and let's try to keep the hell-raising to a minimum, shall we? We're not as young as we used to be." Carl just laughed and clapped me on the back. "Speak for yourself, old man. I'm in the prime of my life." We spent the rest of the day loading up the RV and going over our route. Carl regaled me with stories of his recent adventures. Apparently, he'd spent the last few years bouncing between odd jobs and music gigs, never staying in one place for too long. As night fell, we cracked open a couple of beers and sat on my back porch, watching the stars come out. "You know, Chuck," Carl said, his voice uncharacteristically soft, "I'm glad you're letting me tag along. Truth is, I've been feeling a bit lost lately. Figured maybe this trip might help me find my bearings again." I nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of needing to find oneself. "Well, there's plenty of space up there to do some soul-searching. Just don't get too lost in those woods, all right?" We clinked our bottles together, neither of us aware of how prophetic those words would turn out to be. The next morning we hit the road bright and early. The Winnebago rumbled to life, and we pulled out of my driveway with a sense of anticipation. The journey north was filled with easy conversation and occasional bursts of off-key singing, as Carl insisted on playing DJ with his eclectic mix of classic rock and obscure folk songs. As we crossed the Mackinac Bridge into the Upper Peninsula, I felt a shift in the air. The landscape became wilder, more untamed. Dense forests stretched as far as the eye could see, broken only by the occasional glimmer of a lake or the rugged outline of distant hills. Carl, who had been dozing in the passenger seat, stirred and looked out the window. "Man, would you look at that?" he breathed, his eyes wide. "It's like stepping back in time." I nodded, feeling a sense of awe myself. "That it is. Makes you feel small, doesn't it?" We drove on, deeper into the heart of the peninsula. Our destination was a small, secluded campsite near Tahquamenon Falls that I'd read about in an obscure travel guide. It was off the beaten path, promising solitude and unspoiled natural beauty. As we turned off the main road onto a narrow, winding trail, the trees seemed to close in around us. The RV's headlights cut through the gathering dusk, illuminating a world of deep shadows and rustling leaves. An owl hooted somewhere in the distance, its cry echoing through the forest. "You sure you know where we're going, Chuck?" Carl asked, peering out into the darkness. "Pretty sure," I replied, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The guide said it was about 10 miles down this road. We drove on in silence, the only sound the crunch of gravel under the tires and the occasional creak of the RV's frame. Just as I was beginning to wonder if we'd missed a turn, the trees parted, revealing a small clearing nestled against the banks of a gently flowing river. "This must be it," I said, relief evident in my voice. We parked the RV and stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the nearby Tahquamenon Falls filled the air, a constant, soothing rumble. Stars blanketed the sky, more than I'd ever seen before, their light casting a faint silvery glow over the clearing. "Now this," Carl said, spreading his arms wide, "is what I call getting away from it all." We spent the next hour setting up camp, arranging our outdoor furniture and getting a fire going. As we sat around the crackling flames, eating a simple dinner of canned chili and crackers, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. This was what I'd been looking for, a chance to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. Carl strummed idly on his guitar, picking out a melancholy tune. "You know," he said between chords, "I've got a good feeling about this trip, Chuck. I think we might just find what we're looking for out here." I nodded, gazing into the fire. "I hope you're right, Carl. I really do." As we turned in for the night, settling into our respective bunks in the RV, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I chalked it up to the unfamiliar surroundings and the overactive imagination of a city dweller in the wilderness. But as I drifted off to sleep, I could have sworn I heard something moving in the underbrush just beyond the clearing's edge. Little did I know our peaceful retreat was about to take a turn into territory darker and more terrifying than anything I could have imagined. The next few days passed in a blissful blur of hiking, fishing, and relaxation. We explored the area around our campsite, marveling at the raw beauty of Tahquamenon Falls and the surrounding forest. Carl and I fell into an easy rhythm, reminiscing about old times and sharing our hopes for the future. On our fourth night in the woods, we decided to stay up late, drinking beer and singing around the campfire. Carl had brought his old guitar, and we took turns belting out classic rock songs, our off-key voices echoing through the trees. As the fire died down to embers, Carl set aside his guitar and leaned in close. "Hey, Chuck," he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. "You ever hear any weird stories about these woods?" I raised an eyebrow. "Weird how?" Carl shrugged, taking a swig of his beer. "Oh, you know, ghost stories, local legends, that kind of thing. I was talking to this old guy at the general store when we stopped for supplies yesterday. He was going on about some creature that's supposed to roam these parts. Called it the Vetrax, I think." I chuckled, shaking my head. "Come on, Carl. Don't tell me you believe in that kind of nonsense." "Nah, not really," he replied, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "But you gotta admit, it adds a little spice to the camping experience, doesn't it? Imagining some mysterious beast lurking in the shadows." I was about to respond when a twig snapped in the darkness beyond our campfire. We both jumped, then laughed nervously. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, trying to sound nonchalant. "Come on, it's late. We should turn in." We doused the fire and headed into the RV. As I lay in my bunk, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that had settled over me. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming during the day, now felt oppressive and full of secrets. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to a strange sound. It was just past midnight, according to the glowing digits of the RV's clock. The sound came again, a sort of scratching noise like something dragging across the metal exterior of the vehicle. "Carl," I whispered, sitting up. "You hear that?" Carl was already awake, his eyes wide in the dim light. "Yeah," he whispered back. "What the hell is it?" The scratching continued, moving slowly around the RV. My heart was pounding in my chest as I reached for the flashlight on the nightstand. "Stay here," I told Carl. "I'll check it out." "Are you crazy?" Carl hissed, but I was already moving towards the door. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, flashlight clutched tightly in my hand. I swept the beam around the campsite, half expecting to see some monstrous form looming in the darkness. But there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze and the stars twinkling overhead. I was about to head back inside when something caught my eye. Near the back of the RV, the ground looked disturbed, as if something had been digging. I moved closer, shining the flashlight on the spot. The earth was indeed turned up, with long, deep furrows carved into the soil. but there were no footprints, no sign of what had caused the damage. A chill ran down my spine as I remembered Carl's story about the Vetrax. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought. It was just an animal, I told myself, a bear maybe, or a particularly ambitious raccoon. I hurried back into the RV where Carl was waiting anxiously. "Well?" he demanded as soon as I was inside. "What was it?" I hesitated, unsure of how much to say. "Probably just an animal," I replied finally. "But there's some weird marks on the ground out there, like something was digging." Carl's face paled. "You don't think—" "No," I said firmly. "Whatever you're thinking, just no, it was an animal, Carl, nothing more." We stayed up for a while longer, talking in low voices, trying to convince ourselves that there was a rational explanation for what had happened. But even as exhaustion finally overtook us, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just experienced our first brush with something beyond our understanding. As I drifted off to sleep, I found myself hoping that the morning light would wash away the fears of the night. But deep down I knew that our peaceful retreat had taken a dark turn, and that the true terror was yet to come. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the horrors of the night seeming like a distant dream in the cheerful light of day. Carl and I avoided talking about what had happened, instead focusing on planning our activities for the day. "I was thinking we could hike out a bit further today," I suggested over a breakfast of instant oatmeal. "There's supposed to be some interesting rock formations about 5 miles north of here." Carl nodded, but I could see the tension in his shoulders. "Sounds good," he said, his usual enthusiasm somewhat muted. "Maybe a change of scenery is just what we need." We packed day packs with water, snacks, and basic survival gear, then set out on the trail leading away from our campsite. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, the air fresh and invigorating. As we walked, I could feel some of the unease from the previous night beginning to dissipate. The hike was challenging but rewarding. We climbed steep inclines, scrambled over fallen logs, and forded shallow streams. By midday, we had left the familiar territory around our campsite far behind, venturing into parts of the forest that felt wilder, more untamed. It was Carl who spotted it first, a structure barely visible through the trees, its weathered wood almost indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. "Hey, Chuck," he called out, pointing. "You see that?" I squinted in the direction he was indicating. "Is that a cabin?" We approached cautiously. As we drew closer, it became clear that this was no ordinary cabin. The structure was old, far older than it had any right to be in these remote woods. The roof had partially caved in, and vines and moss covered much of the exterior. It looked as if it hadn't been touched by human hands in decades, maybe even a century. "What do you think?" Carl asked, a mix of excitement and apprehension in his voice. "Should we check it out?" I hesitated. Every instinct was telling me to turn back, to return to the safety of our campsite, but curiosity won out. "All right," I said, "but let's be careful. That roof doesn't look too stable." We approached the cabin slowly, alert for any sign of danger. The door hung crookedly on its hinges, and it creaked ominously as Carl pushed it open. The interior was a mess of broken furniture, rusted tools, and years of accumulated forest debris. Sunlight filtered through holes in the roof, casting eerie shadows across the floor, but it was the walls that caught my attention. Every available surface was covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. They didn't resemble any language or writing system I'd ever seen. The symbols seemed to writhe and twist as I looked at them, creating unsettling patterns that hurt my eyes if I stared too long. "My God," Carl whispered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. "What is all this?" I shook my head, unable to tear my gaze away from the bizarre markings. "I don't know. Some kind of code, maybe? Or—" I trailed off, not wanting to voice the other possibility that had entered my mind. Carl seemed to read my thoughts. "Or some kind of ritual site," he finished, his voice hushed. We spent the next hour exploring the cabin, taking photos and trying to make sense of what we were seeing. But the more we looked, the less sense it all made. There were no personal belongings, no signs of who might have lived here or when, just the endless, maddening symbols covering every wall. As the afternoon wore on, I began to feel increasingly uneasy. The air in the cabin felt thick, oppressive, as if we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. "Carl," I said finally, "I think we should head back. It'll be dark soon, and I don't want to be trying to find our way in the night." Carl nodded, looking relieved. "Yeah, you're right. This place is starting to give me the creeps anyway." As we stepped out of the cabin, I couldn't help but take one last look at those bizarre symbols. For a moment, I could have sworn they were moving, rearranging themselves on the walls. I blinked hard, chalking it up to eye strain and the dim light. The journey back to our campsite was tense and quiet. Both Carl and I were lost in our thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming that morning, now felt oppressive and watchful. Every snapping twig or rustling leaf made us jump. It was nearly sunset by the time we made it back to the RV. The familiar sight of our campsite should have been comforting, but instead, it felt exposed and vulnerable in the fading light. "Let's get a fire going," I suggested, trying to inject some normalcy into the situation. "I don't know about you, but I could use a hot meal and a cold beer." Carl nodded, but his usual enthusiasm was noticeably absent. As we went about our camp routines, I could see him constantly scanning the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge from the gathering darkness. We sat around the campfire that evening, the flickering flames casting long shadows across our faces. The beer and food had done little to ease the tension that had settled over us since our discovery of the cabin. "Chuck," Carl said suddenly, breaking the long silence, "what do you think those symbols meant?" I sighed, poking at the fire with a stick. "I don't know, Carl. Could be anything. Maybe some old trapper's code or what?" Carl pressed. I hesitated, not wanting to give voice to the thoughts that had been swirling in my mind. Or maybe something older, something not entirely natural. Carl nodded slowly, his face grave in the firelight. "You're thinking about that Vetrax story, aren't you?" Before I could respond, a sound cut through the night. The same scratching noise we'd heard the previous evening, but louder now, more insistent. Carl and I exchanged alarmed glances. "That's it," Carl said, standing up abruptly. "I'm getting tired of this. Whatever it is, I'm going to scare it off." He grabbed a burning stick from the fire, brandishing it like a torch. I quickly got to my feet, snatching up the flashlight and a heavy branch that we'd been planning to use for firewood. "Be careful," I warned, but Carl was already marching towards the sound, his makeshift torch held high. We circled the RV, the firelight casting eerie, dancing shadows around us. That's when we saw it, a figure at the edge of our campsite, hunched over and scratching at the ground with long, claw-like fingers. "Hey!" Carl shouted, waving the burning stick. "Get out of here!" The figure didn't react to Carl's shout. It just kept scratching, digging at the earth with a single-minded intensity that sent chills down my spine. Carl took a step closer, and that's when the thing turned towards us. In the flickering light of the torch, I saw its face, or rather the absence of a face. Where there should have been eyes, there were only empty black sockets. Its mouth was a gaping, toothless maw that seemed to stretch impossibly wide. Carl froze, the color draining from his face. "Warren," he whispered, his voice trembling. "What the hell is that?" I couldn't speak. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. This thing, this creature, it couldn't be real. And yet there it was, slowly rising to its full height, easily 7 feet tall, its limbs too long and jointed in all the wrong places. "Run," I finally managed to croak out. "Back to the RV, now!" We turned and ran, panic giving us speed. I could hear it behind us, a sound like dry leaves scraping against stone. We reached the RV and practically dove inside, slamming the door shut and locking it. The scratching started again almost immediately, more frantic now. The whole RV shook with the force of it. "Do you have anything we can use to defend ourselves?" Carl asked, his eyes wild with fear. I rummaged through my supplies, my hands shaking. "I've got a hunting knife and a flare gun," I said, pulling them out, "but I don't know if that'll be enough." We stayed up all night, huddled in the RV, listening to the relentless scratching. Sometimes it would stop for a few minutes, and in those moments of silence, the suspense was almost worse than the noise. We'd strain our ears, wondering if it had gone, only for the scratching to start up again, louder than before. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, the scratching finally stopped. Carl and I looked at each other, exhausted and terrified. "Is it gone?" Carl whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know, but we can't stay in here forever." Slowly, cautiously, we opened the door and stepped outside. The morning air was cool and damp, mist rising from the ground in ethereal tendrils. At first glance, everything looked normal. But then we saw the ground around the RV. The earth was torn up, covered in deep, jagged marks that no animal could have made. And there, a few feet from the RV, was a hole, a perfect circle about 3 feet in diameter, descending into darkness. Carl and I approached it warily. The hole was deep, far deeper than it should have been possible to dig in a single night. And at the bottom, barely visible in the dim light, was a glint of white. "Are those," Carl began, his voice cracking. I nodded grimly. "Bones. Human bones." We looked at each other, the full horror of our situation finally sinking in. Without a word, we turned and began packing up camp as quickly as we could. Neither of us wanted to spend another moment in that haunted forest. As we drove away, the RV bouncing along the rough dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over. That somehow, in some way, the thing we'd encountered, the Vetrax, was still out there, waiting. We didn't stop driving until we reached the nearest town, a small logging community called Newberry. Even then, surrounded by the trappings of civilization, we didn't feel safe. We went to the local police station to report what we'd seen, but the bored-looking deputy behind the desk didn't seem to take us seriously. "Probably just a bear," he said, barely looking up from his paperwork. "They can make a real mess of a campsite if they're after food." "It wasn't a bear," Carl insisted, his voice rising. "We saw it. It was something else." The deputy sighed, finally meeting our eyes. "Look, fellas, I get it. The woods can play tricks on your mind, especially at night. But there's no monsters out there, just animals and the occasional lost hiker. Now, do you want to file a report about vandalism to your campsite, or—" We left the station feeling frustrated and invalidated. Carl was fuming, muttering under his breath about small-town cops and willful ignorance. I was quieter, lost in my own thoughts. Part of me wanted to believe the deputy, to accept the rational explanation that we'd simply been spooked by an animal. But I knew what I'd seen. Those empty eye sockets, that gaping maw, no bear could have looked like that. We got a room at a small motel on the outskirts of town. Neither of us felt up to driving any further, and if I was honest with myself, I was afraid of what might happen if we tried to leave the area. It felt like we were caught in the gravity of something larger than ourselves, something we didn't understand. That night, as we lay in our separate beds, unable to sleep, Carl spoke up. "Chuck," he said, his voice small in the darkness. "What do we do now?" I sighed, staring up at the water-stained ceiling. "I don't know, Carl. I really don't know." The next few days passed in a blur. We stayed in Newberry, telling ourselves we were researching, trying to find out more about the Vetrax and the strange symbols we'd seen in the cabin. But the truth was, we were both too scared to leave. We scoured the local library, pored over old newspapers, and even tried to talk to some of the older residents of the town. But we found nothing concrete, just vague stories and half-remembered legends. The Vetrax, it seemed, was a shadow on the edge of local folklore, never fully seen or understood. It was on our 4th day in Newberry that Carl announced he was leaving. "I can't do this anymore, Chuck," he said, shoving clothes into his duffel bag. "I feel like I'm going crazy. I need to get out of here, get back to the real world." Part of me wanted to go with him, to put this whole nightmare behind us. But something held me back, a need to understand, to make sense of what had happened to us. "I think I'm going to stay a bit longer," I told him. "Just a few more days. There's got to be some explanation for what we saw." Carl paused in his packing, looking at me with a mix of concern and fear. "Don't get lost out there, Chuck," he said softly. "Whatever that thing is, it's not worth your sanity. Or your life." We said our goodbyes the next morning. As I watched Carl's car disappear down the road, I felt a profound sense of loneliness settle over me. But I was determined to see this through, to find some answers. Over the next week, I delved deeper into my research. I expanded my search, looking into Native American legends, early settler accounts, even geological surveys of the area. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. The Vetrax, or something like it, had been part of local lore for centuries. The Ojibwe people had stories of a creature that lived beneath the earth, emerging at night to hunt. Early French trappers wrote of a demon des bois, a demon of the woods, that left strange markings on trees and rocks. But it was a geological report from the 1950s that really caught my attention. The survey team had discovered a network of caves running deep beneath the Upper Peninsula. Most of the system was too narrow for human exploration, but they'd found evidence of something living down there. Claw marks on the cave walls, inexplicable bone fragments, and in one particularly chilling note, a reference to symbols of unknown origin carved into the rock. As I pieced together this information, a theory began to form in my mind. The Vetrax wasn't just some forest creature or local boogeyman. It was something older, something that had been in these woods long before humans arrived. And those symbols we'd seen in the cabin, they were a language, a way of marking territory or casting spells. The cabin itself was probably built by some long-ago trapper or settler who'd had his own encounter with the creature and tried to protect himself with its own symbols. But knowing this didn't make me feel any safer. If anything, it made the threat feel more real, more immediate. Because if the Vetrax was real, if it had been haunting these woods for centuries, then what chance did we stand against it? I stayed in Newberry for another week, gathering as much information as I could, but eventually I knew I had to leave. The motel was getting expensive, and I could sense the locals were starting to view me with suspicion, the strange outsider asking too many questions about old legends. As I packed up my car, I made a decision that I knew was probably foolish, but I couldn't help myself. I was going back to our campsite, just for a day, I told myself, just to see if there was any evidence left, anything to confirm that what we'd experienced was real. The drive back into the forest was tense. Every shadow among the trees seemed to hide a threat. Every rustle of leaves made me flinch. But I pressed on, following the now familiar road to our old campsite. When I arrived, I was shocked to find the area completely undisturbed. There were no signs of our campfire, no marks on the ground where the RV had been parked. Even the hole we'd seen that last morning was gone, the earth smooth and covered in a layer of fallen leaves. For a moment I felt a wave of relief. Maybe it had all been a dream, a shared hallucination brought on by too many campfire stories and Carl's wild imagination. But as I walked around the clearing, something caught my eye. There, carved into the trunk of a massive old oak tree, were the symbols, the same bizarre twisting shapes we'd seen in the cabin. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still light against the dark bark. My heart pounding, I approached the tree. The symbols seemed to shift and move as I looked at them, forming patterns that hurt my eyes and made my head spin. And as I stood there, staring at this impossible message, I heard it, the scratching sound coming from somewhere behind me. I ran. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, not daring to look back. I could hear it pursuing me, that dry, scraping sound growing louder. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, and somehow managed to start the engine. As I sped away, I caught a glimpse of something in my rearview mirror. A tall, twisted shape at the edge of the clearing, its empty eye sockets fixed on my retreating car. Then I was around a bend in the road, and it was gone. I didn't stop driving until I was out of Michigan entirely. I crossed into Wisconsin, then kept going, putting as much distance between myself and the Upper Peninsula as I could. In the years since, I've tried to put that experience behind me. I moved to Florida, about as far from the forests of Michigan as I could get. I've never told anyone the full story, not even my family. Who would believe me? Carl and I kept in touch for a while, exchanging the occasional phone call or letter. But our conversations were always stilted, haunted by the unspoken memory of what we'd experienced. Eventually, we drifted apart. Last I heard, he'd moved to California, taken up surfing. I hope he found some peace out there by the ocean. As for me, I've never been camping again. I can't even bring myself to walk in the woods behind my house, because I know now that there are things out there in the wild places of the world, things that defy explanation or understanding. Sometimes, late at night, I'll wake up to a sound, a faint scratching like claws on metal. In those moments my heart races, and I'm back in that RV, huddled in the dark, listening to the Vetrax trying to get in. It's just the wind in the palm trees, I tell myself, just a branch scraping against the side of the house. But deep down I know the truth. The Vetrax is still out there in the dark forests of Michigan, waiting, watching. And someday, somehow, I fear it might find me again. So if you ever find yourself in the Upper Peninsula, if you're ever tempted to venture off the beaten path and into those ancient woods, remember my story. And really listen to the sounds of the forest at night, because if you hear scratching, if you see strange symbols carved into the trees, run, and don't look back. Because the Vetrax is real, and once it finds you, it never truly lets you go. My name is James Jones, and I am 63 years old now, but the events I'm about to recount happened to me on October 14th, 1995, when I was 34. It was a crisp autumn day, the kind that makes you think of pumpkin pies and warm sweaters. I had just loaded up my RV, a weathered but reliable 1985 Winnebago Chieftain, with enough supplies to last a week in the wilderness. The plan was simple: escape the daily grind of my job as a mechanic in the small town of Millville, Pennsylvania, and lose myself in the vast expanse of the Allegheny National Forest. I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys solitude. Don't get me wrong, I like people well enough, but there's something about being alone in nature that just recharges my batteries. Maybe it's the quiet, or the way the trees seem to whisper secrets if you listen closely enough. Whatever it is, I've been drawn to it for as long as I can remember. This trip, however, was going to be a little different. For the first time in years, I wasn't going alone. My old high school buddy Danny Brooks was coming along. We hadn't spent much time together since our school days, but when I mentioned my plans for a camping trip, his eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Count me in, Jimmy," he'd said, slapping me on the back. I could use a break from the wife and kids. Danny was a good guy, always had been. Tall and lanky, with a mop of unruly brown hair that never seemed to stay in place, he had a way of making everyone around him laugh. Life hadn't always been kind to Danny. He'd lost his job at the paper mill a few months back and was struggling to make ends meet, but you'd never know it from his upbeat attitude. As I pulled up to Danny's house that morning, I could see him waiting on the porch, a duffel bag at his feet and a wide grin on his face. He bounded down the steps as soon as I rolled to a stop, tossing his bag in the back of the RV before climbing into the passenger seat. "Ready for an adventure, Jimmy?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with excitement. I couldn't help but smile back. "You bet, Danny boy, let's hit the road." The drive to Allegheny National Forest took about 3 hours, but it felt shorter with Danny there. We spent the time catching up, swapping stories about our lives since high school. Danny told me about his kids. He had 2, a boy and a girl, and how proud he was of them. I filled him in on my life as a bachelor, the ups and downs of running my own mechanic shop. As we drove, the scenery gradually changed. The familiar sights of our small town gave way to rolling hills, then to the dense, vibrant forests of western Pennsylvania. The trees were a riot of color, fiery reds, bright oranges, and golden yellows, a stark contrast to the deep green pines that stood sentinel among them. We arrived at our campsite around noon. It was a secluded spot I'd discovered on a previous trip, nestled in a small clearing not far from a babbling brook. The site was far enough off the main roads that we were unlikely to be disturbed by other campers, but close enough to civilization that we could make it back to town if we needed to. As I maneuvered the RV into position, Danny whistled appreciatively. "This is something else, Jimmy. How'd you find this place?" I shrugged, trying to hide my pride. "Just got lucky, I guess. Stumbled upon it a couple years back." We spent the next hour setting up camp. I showed Danny how to level the RV using wooden blocks while he helped me set up our outdoor area. We unfolded a couple of camp chairs, set up a portable table, and gathered wood for a fire. By the time we finished, the sun was high in the sky, warming the crisp autumn air. We decided to explore the area a bit before settling in for the evening. I grabbed my old canvas backpack, throwing in some water bottles and trail mix, while Danny packed the 2 rifles we'd brought along. "You think we'll need these?" he asked, hefting one of the guns. I shook my head. "Probably not, but better safe than sorry. There are bears in these woods after all." Truth be told, neither of us was much of a marksman. The rifles were more for peace of mind than anything else. Still, the weight of the gun in my hands was reassuring as we set off into the woods. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirped overhead, small animals rustled in the underbrush, and the wind whispered through the leaves. We walked for about an hour, following a faint trail that wound its way through the trees. Danny pointed out interesting plants and rock formations, his enthusiasm infectious. As we walked, I found myself relaxing more and more. The stress of work, the worries about bills and responsibilities, they all seemed to melt away in the face of nature's grandeur. This was why I came out here, I remembered. This feeling of peace, of being a small part of something so much bigger than myself. We made our way back to the campsite as the sun began to dip towards the horizon. The temperature was dropping rapidly, a reminder of the approaching winter. By the time we reached the RV, we were both ready for a warm meal and a cold beer. I got a fire going while Danny rummaged through our supplies for dinner. We'd packed simple meals, canned goods, instant noodles and the like, but after our hike, even these basic provisions seemed like a feast. As we sat by the fire, eating our dinner and sipping on beers, Danny regaled me with stories from his life. He had a way of turning even the most mundane events into hilarious tales, and I found myself laughing more than I had in months. "Remember that time in high school," he said, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes, "when we tried to sneak into the senior prom?" I groaned, the memory flooding back. How could I forget? We ended up locked in the janitor's closet for hours. Danny laughed even harder, and when they finally found us, we were covered in cleaning supplies and reeking of bleach. We continued like this for hours, reminiscing about old times and sharing new stories. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows across the clearing. The stars came out, more numerous and brilliant than I'd ever seen in town. It was close to midnight when we heard it for the first time. Danny was in the middle of telling a story about a particularly disastrous high school dance when a strange noise echoed through the forest. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a high-pitched wail followed by a series of rapid clicks. We both fell silent, listening intently. The noise came again, seemingly closer this time. "Did you hear that?" Danny asked, his voice low and tense. I nodded, my eyes scanning the darkness beyond our campfire. "Yeah, I heard it. Probably just some animal. These woods are full of critters." But even as I said it, I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever had made that noise, it didn't sound like any animal I was familiar with. We tried to shrug it off, returning to our conversation, but I could tell Danny was spooked. His laugh was a little too loud, his jokes a little too forced. I wasn't feeling much better myself. Every rustle in the undergrowth, every snap of a twig made us both jump. Finally, around 1 a.m., we decided to call it a night. We doused the fire and retreated to the relative safety of the RV, each of us taking a bunk. As I lay there in the darkness, listening to Danny's breathing slowly even out as he fell asleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there in the woods was watching us. It took me a long time to fall asleep that night, and when I finally did, my dreams were filled with strange, shadowy creatures and eerie, echoing cries. I woke the next morning to the sound of birds chirping and sunlight streaming through the RV's small windows. For a moment I was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing my sleep-addled brain. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back, and I remembered where I was. I sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and looked over at Danny's bunk. He was still fast asleep, snoring softly, one arm dangling over the edge of the bed. I chuckled to myself, some things never change. Danny had always been a heavy sleeper, even back in high school. Quietly, so as not to wake him, I slipped out of bed and made my way to the small kitchenette. I put on a pot of coffee, the familiar routine helping to shake off the last vestiges of sleep. As the coffee brewed, filling the RV with its rich aroma, I stepped outside to take in the morning. The clearing was bathed in the soft golden light of early morning. Dew sparkled on the grass and leaves, and a light mist hung in the air, giving everything a dreamlike quality. The strange noises from the night before seemed distant and unreal in the clear light of day. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. This was why I loved camping, moments like these when the world seemed new and full of possibility. The sound of movement from inside the RV told me Danny was finally stirring. A few minutes later he emerged, bleary-eyed and yawning. "Morning sunshine," I said, grinning at his disheveled appearance. He grunted in response, making a beeline for the coffee pot. It wasn't until he downed half a cup that he seemed capable of forming words. "Sleep well?" I asked, pouring myself a second cup. Danny shrugged. "Well enough, I guess. Had some weird dreams, though. Something about strange noises in the woods." I hesitated, wondering if I should mention the sounds we'd heard the night before. In the light of day, it seemed silly to have been so spooked by what was probably just some unfamiliar animal. In the end, I decided to let it go. "So, what's the plan for today?" Danny asked, seeming more awake now that he had some caffeine in his system. I pulled out a well-worn map of the area, spreading it out on the small table outside the RV. "Well, I was thinking we could check out this old fire tower," I said, pointing to a spot on the map. "It's about a 2-mile hike from here. Should give us a great view of the surrounding area." Danny's eyes lit up with interest. "A fire tower? Like one of those old lookout posts?" I nodded. "Exactly. It's been abandoned for years, but I've heard it's still standing. Thought it might be worth checking out." "Sounds great," Danny said, his earlier lethargy completely gone now. "When do we leave?" We spent the next hour getting ready for the hike. I packed a small backpack with water, some trail mix, and a first aid kit, while Danny insisted on bringing one of the rifles, just in case. I didn't argue. After the strange noises last night, I had to admit the idea of having some protection was comforting. We set out around 9 a.m., the morning still cool enough to make the hike pleasant. The trail to the fire tower wasn't marked on any official maps, but I'd heard about it from other campers on previous trips. It was more of a game trail than anything else, winding its way through the dense forest. As we hiked, Danny kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing out interesting plants and rock formations. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself seeing the forest through new eyes. We spotted a family of deer at one point, watching in awed silence as they gracefully picked their way through the underbrush. The hike was mostly uphill, and by the time we caught our first glimpse of the fire tower, we were both breathing heavily. It rose above the treetops, a skeletal structure of weathered wood and rusted metal. Even from a distance it looked precarious, like a strong wind might topple it at any moment. "You sure that thing is safe?" Danny asked, eyeing the tower skeptically. I shrugged. Only one way to find out. As we got closer, the true state of the tower became apparent. The wood was gray and splintered, covered in patches of moss and lichen. The metal stairs spiraling up the side were streaked with rust, and several of the steps were missing entirely. "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," I muttered, suddenly less certain about my plan. But Danny was already moving forward, his earlier hesitation forgotten. "Come on, Jimmy. Where's your sense of adventure?" Shaking my head at his sudden change of heart, I followed him to the base of the tower. Up close it looked even more decrepit. A faded sign warned of the danger, threatening fines and imprisonment for anyone who dared to climb. Danny, of course, took this as a challenge. "Race you to the top," he called over his shoulder, already starting up the stairs. "Danny, wait!" I shouted, but he was already several steps up. Cursing under my breath, I started after him, wincing at every creak and groan of the old structure. The climb was nerve-wracking. Every step felt like it might be the one to give way, sending us plummeting to the forest floor below. But Danny showed no signs of slowing down, and I wasn't about to let him reach the top alone. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, we reached the small cabin at the top of the tower. The door hung askew on its hinges, and most of the windows were long gone, leaving only jagged shards of glass in their frames. "We made it," Danny crowed, pumping his fist in the air. I was too winded to respond, leaning against the railing as I caught my breath. But as my heart rate slowed and I looked around, I had to admit the view was spectacular. We could see for miles in every direction. The forest stretched out below us, a patchwork of greens, reds, and golds. In the distance I could make out the silvery ribbon of a river, and beyond that the faint outlines of mountains on the horizon. "This is amazing," Danny said softly, all traces of his earlier bravado gone. He sounded awed, and I couldn't blame him. It was a breathtaking sight. We spent a good hour up there, taking in the view and exploring the small cabin. It was mostly empty, save for an old rusted stove and a few moldering books. Danny found an old logbook, its pages yellow and brittle with age. Most of the entries were mundane reports of weather conditions and potential fire hazards, but there was something eerie about reading these glimpses into the past. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, we reluctantly decided it was time to head back. The descent was even more nerve-wracking than the climb up, each step carefully placed to avoid the weaker spots in the old structure. When we finally reached solid ground, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. "Let's not do that again," I said, only half joking. Danny laughed, clapping me on the back. Come on, Jimmy. Where's that adventurous spirit of yours?" I shook my head, smiling despite myself. "I think I left it at the top of that death trap." We started back towards our campsite, taking a different route than the one we'd come by. Danny had spotted what looked like an old trail on our way up, and he was curious to see where it led. The trail was overgrown and barely visible in places, clearly unused for many years. We had to push through thick undergrowth, the branches scratching at our arms and faces. But Danny was determined, and I had to admit I was curious too. We'd been following the trail for about an hour when we stumbled upon something unexpected. The trees opened up into a small clearing, and there, half hidden by vines and bushes, stood the remains of an old cabin. "Whoa," Danny breathed, his eyes wide. "What do you think this is?" I shook my head, equally surprised. "No idea. It's not on any of the maps I've seen." The cabin was in a state of advanced decay. The roof had partially caved in, and one wall had collapsed entirely. Nature was slowly reclaiming it, with vines and moss covering much of the remaining structure. "Should we check it out?" Danny asked, already moving towards the cabin. I hesitated. Something about this place gave me an uneasy feeling, but curiosity won out, and I followed Danny into the clearing. As we got closer, I could see that the cabin had once been quite substantial. It was larger than I'd initially thought, with what looked like multiple rooms. Whoever had lived here had been planning to stay for a while. We approached the door, which hung crookedly on its rusted hinges. Danny reached out to push it open, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said, pointing to the ground. There, half hidden in the tall grass, was a set of tracks. They were unlike anything I'd ever seen before, large with what looked like long, sharp claws. Danny whistled softly. "What do you think made those?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's big. Maybe we should head back." But Danny was already pushing the door open, the rusty hinges protesting loudly. "Come on, Jimmy. We've come this far. Don't you want to see what's inside?" Reluctantly, I followed him into the cabin. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of rotting wood and damp. Sunlight filtered in through gaps in the roof and walls, illuminating swirling motes of dust. The cabin seemed to have been abandoned in a hurry. There were still dishes on the table, covered in a thick layer of dust. In one corner, an old iron stove stood silent, its surface pitted with rust. As we explored, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding. It felt like we were disturbing something that should have been left alone. Danny, on the other hand, was in his element. He poked through old drawers and cabinets, exclaiming over his finds. "Look at this, Jimmy," he called, holding up an old, leather-bound book. "It's some kind of journal." I took the book from him, carefully opening its fragile pages. The handwriting was faded and difficult to read, but I could make out bits and pieces. There were mentions of strange noises in the night, of livestock going missing, and a growing sense of fear. The last few entries were particularly disturbing. The writer spoke of seeing something in the woods, something that couldn't be natural. The final entry simply read, "It's coming. God help us all." A chill ran down my spine as I read those words. I looked up to see Danny watching me, his earlier excitement replaced by concern. "What is it?" he asked. I shook my head, closing the book. Nothing good. I think we should go. For once, Danny didn't argue. We left the cabin quickly, both of us eager to put some distance between us and that eerie place. As we hiked back to our campsite, neither of us spoke much. The discovery of the cabin and the contents of that journal had cast a shadow over what had started as a pleasant day. We reached our camp just as the sun was beginning to set. The familiar sight of the RV was comforting after our unsettling discovery. "Let's get a fire going," I suggested, trying to shake off the lingering unease. "I don't know about you, but I could use a drink." Danny nodded emphatically. "I'll second that." We busied ourselves with camp tasks, gathering firewood, starting the fire, preparing dinner. The routine helped to ground us, to push away the strange feelings from earlier. As we sat by the fire, sipping beers and watching the flames dance, Danny finally broke the silence. "What do you think that was all about? The cabin, I mean." I shrugged, taking a long pull from my beer before answering. "I don't know. Maybe some hermit who let his imagination run wild. Or maybe—" I trailed off, not wanting to give voice to the thoughts that had been nagging at me. "Maybe what?" Danny pressed. I sighed. "Maybe there's something out here, something we don't understand." Danny was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice was uncharacteristically serious. "You think it has anything to do with those noises we heard last night?" Before I could answer, a sound echoed through the forest. The same high-pitched wail followed by clicks that we'd heard the night before. Only this time it was much closer. We both jumped to our feet, peering into the darkness beyond our campfire. The woods seemed to have gone eerily silent, as if every creature was holding its breath. "What the hell is that?" Danny whispered, his voice shaky. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know, but let's get inside the RV, now." We quickly doused the fire and retreated to the relative safety of the RV, making sure all the doors and windows were locked. As we sat in the darkness, straining our ears for any sound, I couldn't help but think about the journal we'd found. "It's coming," the final entry had said. I wondered, with a growing sense of dread, if we were about to find out what it was. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of leaves outside had us on edge. We'd brought the rifles inside with us, keeping them close at hand. Not that I really thought they'd do much good against whatever was out there, but their presence was reassuring nonetheless. I must have dozed off at some point because I woke with a start to the sound of something scratching at the side of the RV. The noise was faint but unmistakable, long, slow scrapes that sent shivers down my spine. I looked over at Danny's bunk. He was sitting up, his eyes wide in the darkness. He'd heard it too. We sat in tense silence, barely breathing, as the scratching continued. It moved slowly around the RV, as if whatever was out there was testing for weaknesses, looking for a way in. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise had been. We waited, hearts pounding, for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Just when I thought it might be over, there was a new sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of the RV. It was followed by a thud against the side, hard enough to rock the entire vehicle. Danny let out a strangled yelp, quickly muffled by his own hand. I gestured frantically for him to be quiet, though I'm not sure why. Whatever was out there already knew we were here. The attack, if that's what it was, continued for what seemed like an eternity. The creature, and I was certain now that it was some kind of animal, though unlike any I'd ever encountered, alternated between scratching, growling, and throwing itself against the RV. At one point it managed to crack one of the windows. A long, dark claw appeared in the gap, scrabbling at the edges as if trying to widen the opening. The sight of that claw, unnaturally large and wickedly sharp, nearly broke me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do something, but fear had me paralyzed. It was Danny who finally acted. Moving with a swiftness I wouldn't have thought possible in the cramped confines of the RV, he grabbed one of the rifles and fired a shot through the cracked window. The report of the gun was deafening in the enclosed space. My ears rang, and for a moment all I could hear was a high-pitched whine. Then gradually other sounds filtered in, the creature's roar of pain or rage, the sound of breaking branches as it crashed away through the forest, Danny's ragged breathing. Did you hit it?" I managed to ask, my own voice sounding strange and distant. Danny shook his head, the rifle still clutched tightly in his hands. I don't know, I had to do something. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, jumping at every sound, half expecting the creature to return at any moment. But the woods remained quiet, save for the normal sounds of nocturnal animals going about their business. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, we finally relaxed slightly. Whatever had attacked us seemed to be gone, at least for now. We emerged from the RV cautiously, rifles at the ready. The morning was crisp and clear, with no sign of the terror we'd experienced during the night. But the evidence was there for anyone to see. Deep scratches in the metal siding of the RV, the cracked window, and most disturbingly, a set of enormous clawed footprints in the soft earth around our campsite. Jesus, Danny breathed, crouching down to examine one of the prints. What the hell could have made these? I shook my head at a loss for words. The print was easily twice the size of my hand, with long, curved claw marks extending from each toe. It looked almost like a bear track, but much, much larger and shaped all wrong. We need to get out of here, I said, my voice sounding calmer than I felt. Whatever that thing is, it could come back. Danny nodded, his usual joking manner nowhere to be seen. Yeah, let's go. We packed up camp in record time, not bothering with our usual care. Everything was thrown haphazardly into the RV, our only goal to get on the road as quickly as possible. As I started the engine, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. There, at the edge of the clearing, half hidden by the underbrush, was a shape. It was only there for a moment before it melted back into the forest, but that glimpse was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. It was tall, much taller than a man, with a hunched, powerful build. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural, sickly yellow light. I gunned the engine, not even waiting for Danny to fully close the door before I was speeding down the rough forest road. In the rearview mirror, I could see those glowing eyes watching us leave, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this wasn't over. We drove for hours, not stopping until we'd left the forest far behind. We ended up at a small diner just outside of Warren, both of us looking shell-shocked and disheveled. As we sat in a booth clutching mugs of coffee with shaking hands, Danny finally broke the silence. What do you think that was? I shook my head, still struggling to process everything that had happened. I don't know. I've never seen anything like it. Do you think anyone would believe us if we told them? I snorted a humorless sound. Would you, if you hadn't seen it yourself? Danny was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. No, I wouldn't. We sat in silence for a while longer, each lost in our own thoughts. Finally, I spoke up. We should do some research, see if anyone else has experienced anything similar in that area. Danny nodded, a determined look coming into his eyes. Yeah, we should. There's got to be some explanation for what we saw. And so began our obsession. Over the next few weeks, we spent every spare moment researching, digging through old newspaper archives, scouring internet forums for any mention of strange creatures in the Allegheny National Forest. We found more than we expected. There were old legends of a creature called the Nishoba, described as a towering, fur-covered beast with glowing eyes. Native American stories spoke of a spirit that guarded the deepest parts of the forest, punishing those who disturbed its domain. More recently, there were scattered reports of hikers and campers encountering something strange in the woods. Most were quickly dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications of known animals. But a few were eerily similar to what we had experienced. The more we discovered, the more questions we had. What was this creature? Why had it attacked us? And perhaps most disturbingly, why weren't more people talking about it? We considered going to the authorities, but every time we got close to making that decision, we'd look at each other and shake our heads. Who would believe us? We'd be laughed out of the police station, maybe even accused of making it all up for attention. So we kept our experience to ourselves, confiding only in each other. But the memory of that night never left us. It changed the way we looked at the world, made us realize that there were things out there that defied explanation, things that most people would never believe in. Years passed, and life went on. I continued running my mechanic shop, and Danny eventually found a new job. We both got older, a little grayer, a little slower, but we never forgot what we saw in those woods. Every now and then, we'd hear about another strange sighting in the Allegheny National Forest, and we'd share a look, knowing what others didn't. We never went camping again, at least not in those woods. Some experiences change you forever, and that was one of them. Now, as I sit here at 63 recounting this story, I can't help but wonder, is it still out there, that creature we encountered? Are there more like it? And how many other secrets are hidden in the dark corners of the world, just waiting to be discovered by those unfortunate enough to stumble upon them? I don't have answers to these questions, but I do know one thing. The next time you're in the woods and you hear a strange noise in the night, it might be wise to pay attention, because sometimes the monsters from our nightmares are all too real. It's been nearly 3 decades since that fateful camping trip, but the memories remain as vivid as ever. Danny and I have remained close friends over the years, bonded by our shared experience. We've never spoken of that night to anyone else, but between us, it's a frequent topic of conversation. We've continued our research over the years, albeit more sporadically. Life has a way of getting in the way. Jobs, families, the everyday responsibilities that pile up as you get older. But we've never stopped looking for answers. There have been more sightings over the years, more stories that echo our own. We've connected with a few other people who claim to have encountered the creature we've come to call the Nishoba. Some of their stories are eerily similar to ours, while others differ in the details, but they all share that same sense of terror, that bone-deep certainty that they've encountered something beyond the realm of normal explanation. Danny passed away last year, lung cancer. It was quick, at least, and he didn't suffer much at the end. In his final days, as I sat by his hospital bed, he made me promise something. "Jimmy," he said, his voice weak but his eyes as bright and mischievous as ever, "promise me you'll tell our story someday. People need to know what's out there." I promised, though at the time I had no intention of keeping it. Who would believe me after all? But as the months passed after Danny's death, I found myself thinking more and more about that promise, about the importance of truth, even when it's uncomfortable or unbelievable. So here I am, finally putting our story down in writing. I don't know if anyone will believe it. I'm not sure I would if I hadn't lived through it myself, but it's the truth as best as I can tell it. To those who read this and scoff, who dismiss it as the ramblings of an old man or a work of fiction, I say this: I envy you. I envy your certainty, your belief in a world that's safe and understandable. Hold on to that if you can. But to those who read this and feel a shiver of recognition, who have seen things they can't explain or heard noises in the night that haunt their dreams, I say, you're not alone. There are things in this world that defy explanation, creatures that lurk in the shadows of our comfortable reality. Be careful out there. Be aware. And if you ever find yourself in the Allegheny National Forest and you hear a high-pitched wail followed by a series of clicks, run, and don't look back, because the Nishoba is out there waiting, and it remembers. This is James Jones, signing off. Stay safe and always keep one eye on the shadows. You never know what might be looking back. The sun was setting over Pittsburgh's skyline as I packed the last of my gear into the rented RV. The golden light glinted off the steel and glass of the skyscrapers, a stark contrast to where I was heading. I'd been planning this trip for weeks, or rather, I'd been thinking about it. The actual planning had been decidedly last minute, a hasty decision made in the suffocating confines of my corner office at Hartman Weiss and Associates. I'm Thomas Reeves, 42 years old, recently divorced, and a senior partner at one of Pittsburgh's most prestigious law firms. On paper, I had it all: the career, the money, the respect. But paper doesn't account for the hollow feeling in your chest when you wake up alone every morning, or the gnawing emptiness that comes with realizing your life has become nothing more than a series of billable hours. The divorce had been finalized 6 months ago. Amicable, they called it. As if there's anything truly amicable about dismantling a decade of shared life, divvying up memories like assets on a balance sheet. Sarah had gotten the house, I'd kept the downtown apartment. She'd taken the dog, I had held on to my sanity barely. We'd both walked away with our fair share of regrets and what-ifs. Now, as I closed the RV's storage compartment, I couldn't help but wonder if this impromptu trip was just another form of running away. But from what? The job? The empty apartment? Or maybe from the person I'd become, a man so focused on climbing the corporate ladder that he'd forgotten how to simply exist without the constant pressure of performance reviews and client meetings. I climbed into the driver's seat, the unfamiliar bulk of the RV making me feel small and inexperienced. As I pulled away from my apartment building, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at me seemed older than his years, with deep-set eyes shadowed by lack of sleep and a jawline tense from clenching through too many high-stakes negotiations. The city slowly gave way to suburbs, then to rolling hills and farmland as I headed north towards the Allegheny National Forest. I'd chosen the destination almost at random, pointing at a map and deciding that anywhere green and far from cell towers would do. The forest sprawled across northwestern Pennsylvania, promising over 500,000 acres of wilderness, more than enough space to lose myself for a weekend. As the miles ticked by, I felt the knot in my chest begin to loosen. The constant hum of emails and phone calls faded, replaced by the steady rhythm of the road and the gentle rustle of wind through the trees that lined the highway. I rolled down the window, letting the cool evening air wash over me, carrying with it the scent of pine and wild honeysuckle. It was well past midnight when I finally reached the outskirts of the forest. The moon hung low and full in the sky, casting long shadows across the winding road. I'd long since left the main highway, now navigating narrow, twisting lanes that seemed to disappear into the darkness ahead. Fatigue was setting in, my eyes heavy with the need for sleep. I knew I should find a proper campground, somewhere with facilities and other people. But a part of me, the part that had driven me out here in the first place, rebelled against the idea. I hadn't come all this way to be surrounded by other weekend warriors seeking a sanitized version of nature. No, what I needed was solitude, real, uncompromising isolation. I turned off onto a logging road, the RV's headlights cutting through the dense undergrowth. The path was barely wide enough for the vehicle, branches scraping against the sides as I inched forward. After about a mile, the road opened up into a small clearing. It wasn't much, just a patch of level ground surrounded by towering pines, but it was perfect. I parked the RV, the engine's rumble fading to leave behind an almost oppressive silence. As I stepped outside, the enormity of the forest hit me. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining to create a canopy that blocked out most of the moonlight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. For a moment I stood there, letting the quiet wash over me. No car horns, no sirens, no incessant ping of incoming messages. Just the soft whisper of wind through the trees and the occasional hoot of a distant owl. It was simultaneously peaceful and unnerving, like stepping into a world that had forgotten the existence of humans. I set up camp quickly, more out of a desire for a beer and some rest than any real enthusiasm for outdoor living. The RV came equipped with the basics, a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a surprisingly comfortable-looking bed. I'd brought along some additional supplies, a folding chair, a cooler stocked with beer and simple provisions, and a battery-powered lantern. With everything set up, I grabbed a beer from the cooler and settled into the folding chair outside the RV. The cold can felt good in my hand, a small comfort in the vast, indifferent wilderness surrounding me. As I took my first sip, I let out a long, slow breath, feeling weeks of tension begin to ebb away. The forest was alive with small sounds, the rustle of leaves, the scurrying of unseen creatures in the underbrush. But underlying it all was a profound silence, a quiet so deep it seemed to have physical weight. It pressed in on me from all sides, forcing me to confront thoughts I'd been avoiding for months. I thought about Sarah, wondering not for the first time where we'd gone wrong. Had it been the long hours at the office, the missed anniversaries and forgotten dinners? Or was it something more fundamental, a slow drifting apart that neither of us had noticed until it was too late? I took another swig of beer, letting the bitter taste wash away the equally bitter memories. This wasn't why I'd come out here. I was supposed to be clearing my head, not drowning in old regrets. As the night wore on and the beer can emptied, my thoughts turned to the future. The partnership at the firm, the one I'd worked so hard for, suddenly seemed less appealing. Was that really all there was? Another 20 years of 60-hour weeks, of missed life events and relationships sacrificed on the altar of career advancement? The questions swirled in my mind, each one leading to another, until I felt like I was drowning in a sea of uncertainty. It was almost a relief when I heard it, a sound so out of place in the quiet forest that it jerked me out of my introspection. A twig snapped, somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing. I sat up straighter, my senses suddenly alert. It could have been anything, a deer, a raccoon, any number of harmless forest creatures. But something about the sound, the deliberate nature of it, sent a chill down my spine. I peered into the darkness, straining my eyes to see beyond the small circle of light cast by the RV. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches casting strange, shifting shadows in the moonlight. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I saw it, a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision. Something large, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with its size. It was there and gone in an instant, disappearing behind a thick tree trunk before I could get a clear look. My heart was pounding now, the peaceful atmosphere of earlier shattered. I stood up slowly, my eyes never leaving the spot where I'd seen the movement. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and weak in the vast forest. "Is someone there?" Silence was my only answer, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before. The forest seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. I backed towards the RV, suddenly very aware of how exposed I was. The beer can slipped from my fingers, clattering loudly on the ground. The sound seemed to echo through the clearing, unnaturally loud in the still night air. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, a sound that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the primitive part of my brain that recognized danger. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran for the RV, my heart hammering in my chest. I practically dove through the door, slamming it shut behind me and fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly it took 3 tries to engage the deadbolt. Safe inside the RV, I peered out the window, searching the darkness for whatever had made that sound. But the clearing was empty, the trees standing silent and impassive in the moonlight. As my pulse slowly returned to normal, I tried to rationalize what had happened. It was probably just a bear, I told myself. They were common in these parts, weren't they? The strange movement I'd seen, the unnatural growl, that was just my imagination running wild, fueled by too much beer and too little sleep. But as I lay in bed that night listening to the creaks and groans of the forest around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was watching, waiting. Sleep, when it finally came, was fitful and filled with dreams of shadowy figures moving just beyond the edge of sight. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The true terror that awaited me in the depths of the Allegheny National Forest was beyond anything I could have imagined. And as I tossed and turned in the unfamiliar bed, the creature outside was only just beginning its hunt. I woke to the sound of birdsong, a cheerful chorus that seemed at odds with the unease that had settled over me during the night. Sunlight streamed through the RV's small windows, painting patterns on the floor and walls. For a moment I lay there, disoriented, the events of the previous night, feeling like a half-remembered dream. But as I sat up, wincing at the stiffness in my back from the unfamiliar bed, the memories came flooding back. The strange noises, the flicker of movement in the darkness, the bone-chilling growl that had sent me running for safety. In the harsh light of day, it all seemed ridiculous. I was a grown man, a successful lawyer who faced down corporate sharks on a daily basis, and here I was, spooked by shadows and forest sounds. I made my way to the small bathroom, splashing cold water on my face in an attempt to wash away the last vestiges of sleep and fear. The face that looked back at me from the mirror was haggard, dark circles under my eyes testament to the restless night I'd had. I needed coffee desperately. As the small percolator bubbled away, filling the RV with the rich aroma of brewing coffee, I peered out the window. The clearing looked peaceful in the morning light, dew glistening on the grass and wildflowers nodding gently in the breeze. There was no sign of the terror I'd felt the night before, no indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred. Coffee in hand, I stepped outside, the cool morning air a welcome shock to my system. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp, pine-scented air. It was hard to believe that just hours ago, this same clearing had felt so menacing. Now, with sunlight filtering through the canopy and birds flitting from tree to tree, it seemed like paradise. I walked the perimeter of the clearing, half expecting to find some evidence of last night's visitor tracks maybe, or broken branches, but there was nothing. The forest floor was undisturbed, save for my own boot prints from the night before. As I completed my circuit, a movement caught my eye. At first I tensed, my mind immediately jumping to thoughts of the creature from last night. But it was just a deer, a young doe, picking her way delicately through the underbrush. She froze when she saw me, her large eyes regarding me warily. For a long moment we stood there, human and animal, just watching each other. Then, with a flick of her white tail, she was gone, melting back into the forest as silently as she had appeared. The encounter left me feeling foolish. Here was the most dangerous thing I was likely to encounter in these woods, a skittish deer. I shook my head, chuckling at my own overactive imagination. Clearly I'd been working too hard, letting the stress of the job get to me. A weekend in nature was exactly what I needed to reset my perspective. Feeling rejuvenated, I decided to explore the area around my campsite. I'd come out here to experience nature, after all, not to hide in the RV. I grabbed a backpack, stuffing it with water, some trail mix, and a basic first aid kit. As an afterthought, I added a heavy-duty flashlight and a hunting knife I'd brought along. Better safe than sorry, I reasoned. The forest beyond the clearing was a world unto itself. Massive trees towered overhead, their branches creating a cathedral-like canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft green glow. The ground was carpeted with ferns and moss, punctuated here and there by colorful wildflowers. It was peaceful in a way I hadn't experienced in years, the constant background noise of the city replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves and the occasional call of a bird. As I walked, I found my thoughts drifting back to the life I'd left behind in Pittsburgh, the constant pressure, the endless meetings, the late nights poring over contracts and briefs. When had I last taken time for myself like this? When had I last done anything that wasn't in some way connected to work or advancing my career? The path I was following, little more than a game trail really, led me to a small stream. The water burbled over rocks worn smooth by centuries of flow, creating a soothing white noise that invited contemplation. I found a comfortable spot on a fallen log and sat down, letting the peacefulness of the scene wash over me. It was here, in this quiet glade, that I finally allowed myself to think about Sarah. Not with the bitterness or regret that had characterized my thoughts of her lately, but with a kind of wistful fondness. I remembered the good times, lazy Sunday mornings spent reading the paper in bed, impromptu dance sessions in our kitchen, the way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed. Where had it all gone wrong? The answer, I realized with a pang of guilt, was obvious. I had prioritized my career over everything else, including my marriage. The long hours, the missed dinners, the vacations cut short because of some urgent work matter, it had all added up. By the time I realized what was happening, the distance between us had grown too great to bridge. I picked up a small stone, turning it over in my hands as I considered the choices that had led me to this point. The smooth surface of the rock, worn down by countless years of water flowing over it, seemed like a metaphor for my own life. I had allowed the constant flow of work to wear away at everything else, until all that was left was the polished surface of professional success. But it wasn't too late to change, was it? I was only 42, still young enough to course correct, to find a better balance. Maybe this weekend away was the first step towards something new, something more fulfilling. Lost in thought, I almost missed it. A flicker of movement on the other side of the stream, just at the edge of my peripheral vision. I turned my head quickly, but whatever it was had already vanished into the dense undergrowth. The peaceful mood of the moment evaporated, replaced by a sudden irrational surge of fear. The memory of last night's encounter came rushing back, along with the feeling of being watched. I stood up quickly, my eyes scanning the tree line across the stream. For a long moment there was nothing. Just the gentle flow of the water and the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was about to chalk it up to my imagination, again, when I saw it. A pair of eyes gleaming in the shadows between two large ferns. They were unlike any animal eyes I'd ever seen, too large, too intelligent, and they were fixed directly on me. I took an involuntary step back, my foot slipping on the damp rocks at the stream's edge. I windmilled my arms, trying to keep my balance, but it was too late. I fell backwards, landing hard on the rocky shore. Pain shot through my lower back, and I let out a grunt of discomfort. When I looked up again, the eyes were gone, but the feeling of being watched remained, prickling at the back of my neck. I scrambled to my feet, no longer interested in quiet contemplation or communing with nature. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig now seemed ominous. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming just moments ago, now felt oppressive and threatening. I made my way back to the trail, my eyes darting from side to side, searching for any sign of movement. The weight of the hunting knife in my backpack was reassuring, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it would be woefully inadequate against whatever was out there. The walk back to the campsite seemed to take an eternity. Every shadow held potential danger, every sound a possible threat. By the time the RV came into view, my shirt was soaked with sweat, and my heart was pounding in my chest. I practically ran the last few yards, not stopping until I was safely inside with the door locked behind me. Only then did I allow myself to take a deep breath, trying to calm my racing thoughts. What had I seen out there? Those eyes. They weren't natural. No animal I knew of had eyes like that. And the way they had looked at me, there had been intelligence there, and something else, something that made my skin crawl just thinking about it. I spent the rest of the day in the RV, alternating between pacing the small space and peering out the windows at the surrounding forest. As the hours ticked by and nothing happened, I began to feel foolish again. Was I really going to let some unidentified animal ruin my weekend? I'd come out here to relax, to get away from the stress of my daily life, not to jump at shadows. As evening approached, I made a decision. I wasn't going to cower in the RV like some scared kid. I was Thomas Reeves, a man who faced down corporate raiders and cutthroat CEOs for a living. I could handle a weekend in the woods. With renewed determination, I stepped outside. The clearing was bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, the long shadows of the trees stretching across the ground. I set about gathering wood for a fire, determined to have a proper camping experience. Soon a cheerful blaze was crackling in the fire pit. I sat in my folding chair, a fresh beer in hand, watching as the flames danced and sparks floated up into the darkening sky. The warmth of the fire and the familiar taste of the beer helped to ease my nerves. As night fell, the forest came alive with sound. The chirping of crickets, the soft hooting of an owl, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. But underlying it all was that same deep silence I'd noticed the night before, a quiet so profound it seemed to swallow up all other sounds. I was just starting to relax when I heard it, a twig snapping, somewhere in the darkness beyond the firelight. I sat up straighter, my eyes straining to see into the gloom. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the vast silence of the forest. "Is someone there?" No response came, but I could have sworn I saw movement just at the edge of the clearing. A shadow, darker than the surrounding night, slipping between the trees. I stood up, my heart beginning to race again. "I know you're out there," I said, trying to inject some confidence into my voice. "Show yourself." For a long moment nothing happened, then slowly something began to emerge from the darkness. At first I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It was big, much bigger than any animal that should be in these woods. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its body seeming to flow rather than walk. As it came into the firelight, I felt my breath catch in my throat. The creature before me defied description. It was vaguely humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humanity ended. Its body was covered in a thick, matted fur, but in places I could see what looked like scales underneath. Its limbs were long and sinewy, ending in massive paws tipped with wickedly curved claws. But it was the face that truly horrified me. It was a nightmarish blend of human and animal features, with a protruding snout filled with jagged teeth and eyes, those same intelligent, terrifying eyes I'd seen by the stream, that glowed with an inner light. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to even breathe. The creature regarded me with those unblinking eyes, its head tilted slightly to one side as if it were studying me. Then, with agonizing slowness, its mouth began to open. What came out wasn't a roar or a growl, but something far worse. It was a sound that seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in my brain. A sound that spoke of ancient forests and primal fears, of things that lurked in the dark places of the world, waiting. That sound broke the spell of terror that had held me in place. I turned and ran for the RV, my only thought to get inside, to put something, anything, between me and that monstrosity. I fumbled with the door handle, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Behind me I could hear the creature moving, its footsteps surprisingly quiet for something of its size. Finally the door opened, and I practically fell inside, slamming it shut behind me. I scrambled to lock the door, then backed away, my eyes fixed on the window. For a moment there was nothing. Then a massive shape loomed up, blocking out the starlight. Those glowing eyes peered in at me, and I could have sworn I saw a flicker of amusement in their depths. The creature raised one massive paw and placed it against the window. The glass creaked ominously under the pressure. I knew with sickening certainty that it could break through if it wanted to. The only thing keeping me alive was its apparent curiosity. For what felt like hours, we stayed like that, me pressed against the far wall of the RV, the creature watching me through the window. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, melting back into the darkness of the forest. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the small bedroom of the RV, the hunting knife clutched in my sweating hands, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the breaking point. As soon as it was light enough, I threw my things haphazardly into my bags and started the RV. I didn't bother with breaking camp properly. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. As I drove down the rough logging road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature loping after the vehicle. But nothing followed me. By the time I reached the main road, the events of the night were already starting to take on a dreamlike quality. Had I really seen what I thought I'd seen? Or had it all been some sort of stress-induced hallucination? I didn't stop driving until I reached Pittsburgh, the familiar skyline of the city, a welcome sight after the terrors of the forest. As I pulled up to my apartment building, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I was home. I was safe. But as I stepped out of the RV, something caught my eye. There, on the side of the vehicle, were 3 long, parallel scratches, as if something with massive claws had reached out and... I shook my head, refusing to finish the thought. It was over. I was back in the real world, where monsters didn't exist and the scariest things were contract negotiations and court appearances. Whatever had happened out there in the Allegheny National Forest, I was determined to put it behind me. Yet as I lay in bed that night, in the comfort and safety of my own apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed. The world seemed bigger now, more mysterious, and infinitely more dangerous. And somewhere out there, in the dark depths of the forest, something was waiting, watching, hungry. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this wasn't over. The creature, whatever it was, had let me go this time. But I had a feeling our paths would cross again, and next time I might not be so lucky. As I drifted off into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept circling in my mind. What else was out there, hiding in the shadows of the world I thought I knew? And more importantly, now that I knew of their existence, would they let me continue to live in blissful ignorance? Only time would tell, but one thing was certain, my life would never be the same again. The weeks following my return from the Allegheny National Forest passed in a blur of routine and denial. I threw myself back into work with a fervor that surprised even me, taking on extra cases and working longer hours than ever before. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting on my increased intensity and drive. If they also noticed the dark circles under my eyes, or the way I startled at sudden noises, they were too polite or too intimidated to mention it. At night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing, intelligent orbs staring back at me. I would jerk awake, drenched in sweat, the echo of that unearthly sound still ringing in my ears. More than once I found myself stumbling to the window in the middle of the night, peering out at the city streets below, half expecting to see a monstrous shape slinking through the shadows. I knew I was being irrational. Whatever I had encountered in the forest, if it had even been real and not some sort of stress-induced hallucination, was far away. It couldn't possibly follow me here to the heart of Pittsburgh. Yet the fear lingered, a constant gnawing presence in the back of my mind. It was Sarah who finally forced me to confront what was happening. She called me out of the blue one afternoon, her voice filled with concern. "Tom, is everything okay? I ran into Jim from your office the other day, and he mentioned you've been acting different." I felt a flash of annoyance at Jim's indiscretion, quickly followed by a wave of guilt. Sarah and I might be divorced, but she still cared enough to check up on me. "I'm fine," I lied, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. "Just been busy with work, that's all." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could almost see Sarah's skeptical expression. "Tom," she said softly, "I know you. Something's wrong. Talk to me." For a moment I was tempted to tell her everything, to pour out the whole terrifying story and let her help me make sense of it. But how could I? How could I explain something I barely understood myself? She'd think I was crazy. Hell, I was starting to think I was crazy. "It's nothing, really," I insisted. I took a trip a few weeks ago, camping, and I saw something." "Something?" Sarah prompted when I fell silent. I sighed, rubbing a hand over my face. "I don't know how to explain it. It was probably nothing, just my imagination running wild. But ever since then I've been having trouble sleeping, jumping at shadows. It's stupid, I know." There was another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was gentle. "Have you considered talking to someone about this? A professional, I mean." I bristled at the suggestion. "A shrink? Come on, Sarah, I'm not crazy." "I didn't say you were," she said quickly. "But Tom, you're not acting like yourself. Whatever happened out there, whatever you think you saw, it's clearly affecting you. There's no shame in seeking help to process that." I wanted to argue, to defend myself, but I found I didn't have the energy. And deep down, I knew she was right. Something had to change. I couldn't go on like this, jumping at every shadow and lying awake at night. "Maybe you're right," I conceded. "I'll think about it." We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation drifting to safer topics. Mutual friends, her new job, the unseasonably warm weather we'd been having. By the time we hung up, I felt, not better exactly, but lighter somehow, as if sharing even that small part of my experience had lifted some of the weight from my shoulders. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I made a decision. I would seek help, not because I believed I was crazy, but because I needed to understand what had happened to me. I needed to make sense of the creature I'd seen, to reconcile it with the rational, logical world I'd always believed in. The next morning, I asked my assistant to find me a reputable therapist. She gave me an odd look but didn't comment, for which I was grateful. By that afternoon, I had an appointment scheduled for the following week with Dr. Elena Rossi, a psychologist who specialized in trauma and PTSD. As the day of my appointment approached, I found myself growing increasingly anxious. What would I say? How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely unhinged? More than once I was tempted to cancel, to retreat back into the safety of denial and overwork. But each time I forced myself to stay the course. I needed answers, even if I was afraid of what those answers might be. The day of the appointment dawned gray and drizzly, matching my mood perfectly. Dr. Rossi's office was in a converted brownstone in one of Pittsburgh's older neighborhoods. As I climbed the steps to her door, I felt a sense of trepidation mixed with a strange sort of relief. Whatever happened in that office, things were going to change. For better or worse, I was taking the first step towards understanding what had happened to me in those woods. Dr. Rossi herself was a surprise. I'd been expecting someone older, perhaps a bit stern. Instead, I was greeted by a woman probably a few years younger than me, with kind eyes and a warm smile. Her office was cozy and inviting, with comfortable chairs and soft lighting that immediately put me at ease. "So, Mr. Reeves," she said once we were settled. "What brings you here today?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was it, the moment of truth. I saw something, I began hesitantly, something I can't explain. And ever since then, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that the world isn't what I thought it was. Dr. Rossi nodded encouragingly, her expression open and free of judgment. "Why don't you start at the beginning?" she suggested. "Tell me about what led up to this experience." And so I did. I told her about the stress at work, about my failed marriage, about the impulsive decision to go camping. I described the clearing in the Allegheny National Forest, the peaceful first day and the terror of that night, and finally, haltingly, I told her about the creature. As I spoke, I kept waiting for her to interrupt, to tell me I was clearly suffering from some sort of delusion. But she just listened, occasionally making notes or asking for clarification. When I finally fell silent, she sat back in her chair, regarding me thoughtfully. "Mr. Reeves," she said after a moment, "what you've described is clearly a traumatic experience. Whether or not the creature you saw was real in the conventional sense, the fear and stress you felt were very real. And it's not uncommon for our minds to process extreme stress or trauma through symbolic or even seemingly supernatural experiences." I felt a mix of relief and frustration at her words. On one hand, she wasn't dismissing me outright or suggesting I was crazy. On the other, her explanation felt insufficient. It didn't capture the visceral reality of what I'd seen, the bone-deep certainty that I had encountered something beyond the bounds of normal experience. "But what if it wasn't just stress?" I pressed. "What if what I saw was real?" Dr. Rossi's expression softened. "Mr. Reeves, I'm not here to tell you what is or isn't real. My job is to help you process your experience and find ways to cope with its aftermath. Whether the creature was a physical reality or a manifestation of your subconscious, the effect it's had on you is very real, and that's what we need to focus on." I nodded slowly, digesting her words. It wasn't the validation I'd been hoping for, but it was a start, a framework for understanding if nothing else. "So what now?" I asked. "Now," Dr. Rossi said with a smile, "we work on helping you feel safe again, on processing your experience and finding ways to integrate it into your understanding of the world without letting it control your life." As I left her office that day, I felt not cured, certainly. The fear was still there, the uncertainty about what I'd seen and what it meant. But for the first time since that night in the forest, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever had happened out there, whatever I had seen, I didn't have to face it alone anymore. Over the next few weeks, I continued to see Dr. Rossi. Our sessions became a lifeline, a safe space where I could voice my fears and doubts without judgment. We worked on coping mechanisms for my anxiety and sleeplessness, and slowly I began to feel more like myself again. But even as I made progress in therapy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world seemed different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing hidden depths and shadows I'd never noticed before. It was about a month after my first session with Dr. Rossi that it happened. I was walking home from the office late one night, my mind preoccupied with a difficult case. The streets were nearly empty, the few people still out hurrying to get home or to their next destination. As I passed an alley, something caught my eye, a movement in the shadows, too fluid to be human. I froze, my heart suddenly pounding in my chest. For a moment I was back in that forest clearing, staring into those unnatural eyes. Then a cat emerged from the alley, its yellow eyes reflecting the streetlight as it regarded me curiously before slinking away into the night. I let out a shaky breath, equal parts relief and disappointment flooding through me. Just a cat, nothing more. I shook my head, chiding myself for jumping at shadows. This was exactly the kind of thing Dr. Rossi and I had been working on. But as I turned to continue on my way, I saw it. Just for an instant, in the reflection of a shop window, a massive, shadowy form, those same glowing eyes I remembered so vividly. I whirled around, but the street behind me was empty. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. It rang 3 times before a sleepy voice answered. "Dr. Rossi, I'm sorry to call so late, but I think I saw it again, here, in the city." There was a pause on the other end of the line. When Dr. Rossi spoke, her voice was calm and reassuring. "Thomas, remember what we talked about. Your mind is still processing your experience. It's not uncommon to have flashbacks or to misinterpret ordinary stimuli in light of a traumatic event." I wanted to believe her. Part of me knew she was probably right. But another part, a part that was growing stronger by the day, knew that what I'd seen was real. "What if it's not just in my head?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "What if it followed me?" Dr. Rossi sighed softly. "Thomas, I want you to listen to me carefully. You're safe. You're in the middle of Pittsburgh, not in the forest. Whatever you think you saw, it can't hurt you. I want you to practice those breathing exercises we worked on, okay? Focus on your breath, on the here and now." I nodded, then realized she couldn't see me. "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Okay, I'll try." We talked for a few more minutes, her calm voice helping to ground me in reality. By the time we hung up, my heart rate had returned to normal, and the immediate panic had subsided. But the doubt remained, a seed planted in the fertile soil of my fear. That night marked a turning point. I couldn't ignore it anymore, couldn't pretend that what had happened in the forest was just a one-time event that I could leave behind. Whatever I had encountered out there, it had awakened something, in the world, in me, or perhaps both. I threw myself into research, spending every free moment poring over books on folklore, cryptozoology, and the unexplained. I scoured the internet for similar encounters, for any shred of evidence that might validate my experience. Most of what I found was clearly nonsense hoaxes, misidentifications, or the ramblings of conspiracy theorists. But here and there, buried in the noise, I found accounts that resonated with my own experience. Stories of encounters in remote wilderness areas, of creatures that defied conventional explanation. One account in particular caught my attention. It was from a hiker in the Pacific Northwest, describing an encounter with a creature that sounded eerily similar to what I had seen. The details were different, the setting, the specific appearance of the creature, but the essence was the same. The sense of otherworldliness, of encountering something that shouldn't exist in our rational, scientific world. I reached out to the author of the account, half expecting never to hear back. To my surprise, I received a response within days. The hiker, a woman named Allison, was eager to talk to someone who had had a similar experience. We arranged a video call, and as soon as Allison's face appeared on my screen, I knew she was telling the truth. There was a look in her eyes that I recognized all too well, a mix of fear, wonder, and the haunted expression of someone who has seen behind the curtain of reality. "I thought I was going crazy," Allison confessed after we had shared our stories. "No one believed me. They all said it must have been a bear or that I was hallucinating from dehydration. But I know what I saw." I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. "I know exactly what you mean. It's not something you can explain to someone who hasn't experienced it." We talked for hours, comparing notes and theories. Allison had done her own research in the years since her encounter, and she had some ideas that made an uncomfortable amount of sense. "I think they've always been here," she said, her voice low as if she was afraid of being overheard. "These creatures, whatever they are, they've been living alongside us, hiding in the wild places of the world, and sometimes when we venture into their territory, we catch a glimpse of them." "But why?" I asked. "Why show themselves at all? Why not stay hidden?" Allison shrugged. "Maybe they're curious about us too, or maybe they're testing us, seeing how we react. I don't know, but I do know this. Once you've seen them, they don't forget you, and I don't think they let go easily." Her words sent a chill down my spine, confirming a fear I'd been trying to ignore. The creature I'd seen hadn't just been a random encounter. It had chosen to reveal itself to me, and now somehow it had followed me back to the city. As our call ended, I felt a mix of relief and trepidation. On one hand, it was incredibly validating to talk to someone who understood, who had been through something similar. On the other, Allison's theories opened up a world of terrifying possibilities. If she was right, if these creatures really had been living alongside us all this time, what did that mean for our understanding of the world? And more importantly, what did it mean for me? Was I now marked in some way, chosen for some purpose I couldn't begin to understand? In the days that followed, I found myself looking at the world differently. Every shadow seemed to hold potential secrets, every unexplained sound a possible sign of something otherworldly. I knew I was walking a dangerous line between healthy skepticism and paranoia, but I couldn't help it. The world had changed for me, and there was no going back. I continued my sessions with Dr. Rossi, but I found myself holding back, no longer sharing the full extent of my thoughts and fears. How could I explain to her that I was now in contact with others who had had similar experiences, that I was becoming convinced that what I had seen was not just real, but part of a larger hidden world? As weeks turned into months, I settled into a new normal. On the surface, I was the same Thomas Reeves, successful lawyer, divorced but doing okay, maybe a bit more intense than before, but nothing too out of the ordinary. But beneath that facade, I was changed. I lived with one foot in the everyday world and one in the shadows, always watching, always waiting. And sometimes in the dead of night, when the city was as quiet as it ever got, I could have sworn I heard something. A sound just on the edge of hearing, a cross between a growl and that unearthly noise I'd heard in the forest. In those moments, I knew with bone-deep certainty that it was out there, watching, waiting, and sooner or later our paths would cross again. The question was, when that moment came, would I be ready? Or would I once again find myself face to face with something beyond my comprehension, something that challenged everything I thought I knew about the world? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain. My journey into the unknown was far from over. It had only just begun. The months following my conversation with Allison passed in a blur of work, research, and an ever-present sense of anticipation. I threw myself into my job with renewed vigor, taking on more cases and working longer hours than ever before. My colleagues noticed the change, commenting on my increased intensity and drive. If they also noticed the new edge of paranoia in my behavior, the way my eyes would dart to the shadows or how I'd startle at unexpected noises, they were too polite or too unnerved to mention it. My nights were spent in a frenzy of research. I devoured books on cryptozoology, folklore, and unexplained phenomena. I joined online forums dedicated to supernatural encounters, sifting through countless hoaxes and misidentifications in search of accounts that rang true. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, biding its time. It was on a crisp autumn evening, nearly 6 months after my encounter in the Allegheny National Forest, that everything changed once again. I was walking home from the office, my mind preoccupied with a particularly challenging case, when I felt it, that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck that I'd experienced in the forest. I stopped in my tracks, my heart suddenly pounding. The street around me was busy with the usual evening foot traffic, people hurrying home or out to dinner, oblivious to the sudden tension that had gripped me. I scanned the area, my eyes darting from shadow to shadow, searching for something out of place. And then I saw it. Just for an instant, in the reflection of a shop window, a pair of glowing eyes, set in a face that was both familiar and utterly alien. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Just the normal bustle of city life, no sign of the creature I'd glimpsed. I stood there for a long moment, my breath coming in short gasps, torn between relief and disappointment. Had it really been there? Or was my mind finally cracking under the strain of the past months? As I turned to continue my walk home, a flyer caught my eye. It was tacked to a telephone pole, half hidden behind advertisements for local bands and lost pets. But something about it drew my attention. The image on the flyer was blurry, indistinct, but it sent a jolt of recognition through me. It looked like... But no, it couldn't be. I tore the flyer from the pole, my hands shaking slightly as I read the text. Have you seen something you can't explain? Encountered creatures that shouldn't exist? You're not alone. Join us for a meeting of the Pittsburgh Paranormal Research Society. All experiences welcome, skeptics and believers alike. Below was an address and a date, tomorrow night. I stared at the flyer, my mind racing. This had to be a coincidence, right? Just a group of amateur ghost hunters or UFO enthusiasts. It couldn't possibly have anything to do with what I'd experienced. But as I stood there, the flyer clutched in my hand, I knew I had to go. If there was even the slightest chance that these people had information, that they might be able to help me make sense of what was happening, I had to take it. The next evening found me standing outside a nondescript community center in one of Pittsburgh's older neighborhoods. I debated whether or not to tell Dr. Rossi about the meeting, but ultimately decided against it. She'd been supportive, but I knew she still saw my experience as a manifestation of stress and trauma rather than a real encounter. This felt like something I needed to do on my own. As I pushed open the door and stepped inside, I wasn't sure what I expected. Part of me was prepared for a room full of tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists. Instead, I found myself in a small meeting room with about a dozen ordinary-looking people. They could have been a book club or a neighborhood watch group, chatting quietly among themselves as they waited for the meeting to start. A woman at the front of the room noticed me hovering in the doorway and waved me over. "First time?" she asked with a friendly smile. When I nodded, she continued, "I'm Linda. Don't worry, we don't bite. Well, most of us don't anyway." She winked, and I found myself relaxing slightly. As the meeting got underway, I was struck by the variety of experiences people shared. There were stories of ghostly encounters, of UFO sightings, of prophetic dreams. Some sounded far-fetched, others disturbingly plausible, but through it all, there was a sense of community, of people united by experiences they couldn't explain and couldn't share with the outside world. When it came my turn to speak, I hesitated. These people seemed nice enough, but could I really trust them with my story? In the end, the need to share, to unburden myself of the secret I'd been carrying for months, won out. I told them everything, the camping trip, the creature I'd seen, the lingering sense that I was being watched or followed. As I spoke, I saw recognition dawn in some of their eyes. They believed me. More than that, some of them had seen similar things. After the meeting, a small group of us gathered at a nearby diner. Over coffee and pie, we swapped stories and theories. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure to finally be able to talk openly about what I'd experienced. One of the group, a man named Mike who worked as a park ranger, leaned in close. "Look," he said in a low voice, "I don't know exactly what you saw out there, but I can tell you this. You're not the first. We've had reports of something in the Allegheny National Forest for years. Most of the time we write them off as bear sightings or overactive imaginations. But sometimes—" He trailed off, his eyes distant. "Sometimes what?" I pressed. Mike shook his head. "Sometimes the reports are too specific, too consistent to ignore. But every time we try to investigate, the trail goes cold. It's like whatever's out there knows we're coming." As the night wore on and the conversation deepened, I felt a shift happening. The fear and isolation that had dominated my life for the past months were being replaced by something else. A sense of purpose, of being part of something larger than myself. By the time we parted ways, plans had been made. We would mount our own expedition into the Allegheny National Forest, armed with cameras and other equipment. We would find proof of what was out there, one way or another. As I walked home that night, my mind was buzzing with excitement and apprehension. Part of me knew this was dangerous, that I was potentially putting myself in harm's way. But a larger part felt alive for the first time in months. I had a mission now, a purpose beyond just waiting and watching. Little did I know, as I climbed the stairs to my apartment that night, that I was taking the first steps on a journey that would change my life forever. The creature I'd encountered in the forest had opened my eyes to a hidden world, and now I was willingly stepping deeper into that world, with no idea of the dangers or the wonders that awaited me. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my dreams were filled with shadowy forests and glowing eyes. But for the first time in months, the dreams didn't feel like nightmares. They felt like a challenge, a call to action. Whatever was out there, whatever had chosen to reveal itself to me, I was going to find it. And this time, I wouldn't be alone. The expedition was set for the following weekend. As the days ticked by, I found myself oscillating between excitement and terror. Was I really going to do this? Go back into those woods, deliberately seeking out the thing that had haunted my nightmares for months? But every time doubt crept in, I reminded myself of the alternative. A life spent looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows, never knowing the truth about what I'd seen. No, I had to do this. I had to know. The night before we were set to leave, I sat in my apartment, going over my gear one last time, camping equipment, cameras, extra batteries, everything we might need to document our expedition. As I zipped up my backpack, my eyes fell on the hunting knife I'd brought on my first trip to the forest. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It had seemed so inadequate that night, facing down something beyond my comprehension. But now it felt like a link to that experience, a talisman of sorts. I was just about to pack the knife when my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Linda from the Paranormal Research Society. "Thomas, we have a problem," she said, her voice tense. "Mike's been in an accident. He's okay, but he's in the hospital with a broken leg. He can't make the trip." My heart sank. Mike's experience as a park ranger had been a key part of our plan. Without him, we'd be going in practically blind. "Should we postpone?" I asked, though the thought of delaying filled me with a mix of relief and disappointment. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No," Linda said finally. "We've been planning this for weeks, and, Thomas, I don't know how to explain it, but I have a feeling, like if we don't go now, we might miss our chance." I knew exactly what she meant. Ever since that night in the forest, I'd developed a sort of sixth sense, an awareness of things just beyond the edge of normal perception, and right now, that sense was telling me Linda was right. "Okay," I said, "we go as planned." The next morning dawned gray and misty, a fitting atmosphere for our expedition. We met at the agreed-upon spot on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, myself, Linda, and two others from the group, a college student named Jess and a retired physics teacher, Harold. As we loaded our gear into Harold's SUV, I couldn't shake a feeling of unease. Were we really prepared for what we might find? Or were we just a group of amateurs stumbling into something far beyond our understanding? The drive to the Allegheny National Forest was tense, filled with nervous chatter and last-minute checks of our equipment. As we entered the forest proper, following the same logging road I'd taken months ago, a hush fell over the group. The trees pressed in close on either side, their branches seeming to reach for us as we passed. We set up camp in a clearing not far from where I'd had my original encounter. As we worked, I found my eyes constantly drawn to the tree line, searching for any sign of movement. But the forest remained still and silent, offering no hints of the secrets it held. As night fell, we gathered around the campfire, our equipment set up in a perimeter around us. Cameras, motion sensors, audio recorders. If anything came near our camp, we'd know about it. "So what exactly are we looking for?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to answer, but found I didn't have the words to describe what I'd seen. How could I explain the impossible blend of features, the sense of ancient alien intelligence in those eyes? "We'll know it when we see it," Linda said, saving me from having to answer. For now, we watch and we wait. The hours crept by, the fire burning low as we took turns keeping watch. It was nearing midnight, and I was just about to suggest we turn in when one of our motion sensors let out a shrill beep. We froze, eyes darting to the tree line. For a long moment there was nothing. Then, slowly, a shadow detached itself from the darkness between two massive pines. My breath caught in my throat. It was there, the same creature I'd seen all those months ago. It moved with that same unnatural fluidity, its body seeming to flow rather than walk. As it entered the dim light cast by our dying fire, I heard Jess let out a strangled gasp. The creature was even more terrifying than I remembered. Its body was a nightmarish blend of features, the thick fur of a bear, the sinuous movement of a big cat, but with proportions all wrong for any known animal. And its face, God, its face. A elongated snout filled with teeth that looked more like shards of obsidian than anything that should exist in nature. And those eyes, glowing with an inner light that spoke of intelligence far beyond that of any mere animal. "Cameras," Harold whispered urgently. "Get the cameras." We scrambled for our equipment, but our movements seemed to break whatever spell had held the creature in place. It let out a sound, that same bone-chilling noise that had haunted my dreams for months, and then it was moving, faster than anything that size should be able to move. It crossed the clearing in what seemed like a single bound, heading straight for me. I had a fleeting impression of massive claws, of hot breath that smelled of decay and something alien. Then I was on the ground, the creature looming over me. Time seemed to slow. I was aware of the others shouting, of the crack of a branch as someone, Linda, I thought, swung it at the creature. but all I could focus on were those eyes, boring into mine with an intensity that felt like it was peeling back layers of my very being. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature was gone, melting back into the forest as if it had never been there at all. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. As my friends helped me to my feet, babbling questions and exclamations, I realized something had changed. The encounter hadn't left me terrified, as it had the first time. Instead, I felt chosen, as if the creature had been testing me, measuring me against some unknown standard. In the days that followed, as we pored over our footage and recordings, finding frustratingly little concrete evidence of what we'd seen, that feeling only grew stronger. Whatever this creature was, wherever it had come from, it had revealed itself to me for a reason, and I was determined to find out why. Our expedition marked the beginning of a new chapter in my life. I threw myself into research with a fervor that bordered on obsession, reaching out to experts in fields ranging from cryptozoology to theoretical physics. I took leave from my job, using my savings to finance further expeditions into the forest. My friends from the Paranormal Research Society stuck with me for a while, but as months passed with no further sightings, they gradually drifted away, back to their normal lives. But I couldn't let it go. I knew the creature was out there, knew it was only a matter of time before our paths crossed again. It was nearly a year after our expedition when it happened. I was alone in the forest, having set up a small research station in an abandoned ranger cabin. As I sat at my makeshift desk, poring over maps and blurry photographs, I felt that familiar prickling sensation on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, and there it was, standing in the open doorway of the cabin. But this time there was no fear, no urge to run. Instead, I felt a sense of inevitability, as if my entire life had been leading to this moment. The creature regarded me for a long moment, those intelligent eyes seeming to look through me. Then, slowly, deliberately, it turned and walked back into the forest, and without hesitation, I followed. As I stepped into the trees, leaving behind the last vestiges of my old life, I knew I was embarking on a journey from which there might be no return. But I also knew with a certainty that defied explanation that I was on the right path. Whatever mysteries awaited me in the depths of the forest, whatever truths the creature had to reveal, I was ready to face them. The world I had known was behind me now. Ahead lay the unknown, the impossible, the extraordinary. And I, Thomas Reeves, once a simple lawyer from Pittsburgh, was stepping willingly into that new world, ready to uncover its secrets, no matter the cost.